All right, we're going to start our part two of reflections on the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We're going to be talking once again with Michael Donahue, who is a retired professor of art from the University of Texas System. He was a park ranger at the battlefield of Little Bighorn for 35 years. And I wanted to just share with you some of the works he's done on the battle itself. This is several of the books he's written, drawing battle lines, the map testimony of Custer's last fight. Michael, that's going to be reprinted more or less, do you think?
Yeah, I've already revised it in a softcover edition. The original version had 83 maps, and the new book that I just got through publishing recently and printing has 100 maps. And all these maps are made by people who are eyewitnesses to the battle or people who recorded statements and drawings from these people. So it was an extremely expensive book to produce, and that's why no one had done one before. I figured out what a fool I was when I paid all those usage fees for the maps and so forth. But it doesn't use drawings of the maps; it uses the original maps, which makes it Jim Donovan, who wrote Terrible Glory, counted it in one of the top 10 books that everyone should own if they want to study the Battle of Little Bighorn. That was an ultimate compliment from Jim Donovan, who is a great writer.
Right. And fortunately, it'll be available in a lesser price than what we see on Amazon and eBay, which is $250, $1,000 and things
Yeah,
like that.
crazy, crazy
Yeah,
prices.
crazy prices.
It
And
sells for 69.95, by the way.
all right. And here we have your second book, When the Rivers Ran Red, The Indian Fights of George Armstrong and Custer. That's still in print, correct?
It is, yes. I also carry that one, and there's other bookstores that carry it as well. But yeah, that's the only book. One of the things that I try to do when I write is find a niche that other people have not covered. And there's over 3,000 books on Little Bighorn and its participants. But no one had ever done a book on just Custer's four Indian fights. And it's really an important book because it gets into the strategies. Not only is this hostage taking, but also how that the Washita was so influential on his movements and tactics at the Little Bighorn.
Okay. And the most recent book is Reminiscence. What's this about?
Yeah, this is kind of a personal memoir. As a park ranger there, the longest serving park ranger at Little Bighorn, I was there for 35 summers. And the book is about how I got interested in the story in and of itself, but also it's 35 years of kind of the history of what goes on behind the scenes, working at perhaps the most controversial park in the United States. One of the jokes we used to say is if you can work at Little Bighorn, you can work anywhere because of all the different controversies. And everybody's aiming at you from different angles, obviously, with the story. And the book is also about the changing interpretation because it's changed a lot in the last 35 to 40 years with the name change, with some of the protests there, and of course with the new Indian Memorial and memorial markers for the warriors. So all that it's kind of a crazy book because it's got a lot of humor in it. I like to tell lots of the funny stories that happened at Little Bighorn, but at the same time, it's got some very serious things, and it's sad in many many parts. So it's kind of back and forth, kind of like the movie Little Big Man. I sometimes compare it to it. One minute you're laughing your butt off, and then the next you're almost crying your eyes out. And so this book kind of is very personal in that it deals with kind of the last 35 to 40 years of what's happened there.
Interesting. Yeah, when you say if you can be a park ranger at Custer Battlefield, you can be a park ranger everywhere.
Anyway,
It sort of sounds like Frank Sinatra singing about New York City anyway.
yeah,
Uh,
it does.
all right, so let's start off with a basic, simple question, which you actually wanted to explicate, and that is why do people get so worked up over this battle? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a question I've asked myself many times because like I said, I've talked to over a million people there in my 35 years. And I always ask myself, who's in the audience? what's the age group? And I ask them, always ask them to raise their hand. How many of you have been here before? And only about 10% of the people in my crowd have been there before. So 90% of my crowd is new. They don't know the story well. So I'm kind of a teacher, obviously. But people from around the world love to come here. I mean, people from England, as I mentioned to you earlier, there's a group in England, the Custer Association of Great Britain, and they gather annually. And a lot of those guys were here at the 150th anniversary. But they study this battle in great detail. Um, some of the best Indian, I would say, crow quill makers and beaters are in Czechoslovakia, of
Really?
all
Wow.
places. Yeah, and the trading post sells some of their things, which you can't tell from many of the native things that are made. But I think there's three reasons why people are drawn to this story from around the world. Number one is there's the element of mystery. Even though we have artifacts, even though we have participants both on the soldier side and the warrior side, no warrior or no soldier saw the entire thing happen because it was such over a large area. The terrain blocked your view. Uh, some people had an agenda afterwards, but there's that element of mystery. And I think every one of us has a little bit of Sherlock Holmes in us. We want to know what happened, and we want to study and try to figure out, well, did he do this? Did this happen? Whatever. And that element of mystery is there. And what I find interesting about people who like Little Bighorn, they like some other stories that deal with human tragedy and human loss and mystery. For example, almost every one of these guys is just in the assassinates of John F. Kennedy. The Titanic always appears. These guys have this common thread where they like to talk about the Titanic. Or it could be the Alamo, of course. I'm from Texas, so everybody wants to know what happened to Davy and all these guys down here and what really happened at the Battle of the Alamo. So I find that a common thread. It's almost like if you hit Google, if you like Little Bighorn, you'll like the Titanic, the Alamo, and JFK.
Hmm.
But that element of mystery, I think, is one of the things that draws so many people to the story. Number two is the people that were there at that one event were pretty phenomenal. They were very intriguing, complex individuals. You look at somebody like George Armstrong Custer, and a very complex person, a person who's different in the Civil War than he is in the Indian Wars. And people loved him or hated him, kind of like I mentioned, George Patton. Then you got the character of Sitting Bull, this amazing traditionalist. At one time, a great warrior who, by the time of Little Bighorn, he's wanting to be left alone. A guy who refuses to sign any treaties with the U.S. government, refuses to do that. A man with dark, piercing eyes who walks with a limp because he got shot in several battles with some of the Crows, which he really hated. And you get into all this tribal warfare. But here's a guy who goes around the world with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, learns how to sell his signature and makes quite a bit of money. And then of course he'll be shot and killed in an interesting story right before Wounded Knee in 1890. But a phenomenal individual who tries to survive in Canada for years and years, and it just doesn't work out. And then the third biggie, of course, is Crazy Horse. And Crazy Horse is just a unique individual. Again, a very brave man, a tremendous warrior who fought at many of the Red Cloud fights, probably Fetterman and some of the other fights after that. But he's going to lose his shirt. Literally, he's a shirt wearer, which is a very important political position. But when he runs off with another man's wife, then he loses that influence. And so at Little Bighorn, he's looking for redemption. He's a strange man. That's why the Oglala Lakota called him the strange man. He never sang and he never danced. And he had a wife who basically she gave birth to a daughter who eventually will die of smallpox, which is another reason for hating the white man and not signing any treaties. And of course, he'll die a tragic death as well. All three of these guys end up with kind of rough, terrible deaths. And but they're individuals that became very famous, very well known, and they're all at this one event. And then there's a third factor that plays into the lore and the draw, and that's the battlefield itself.
Hmm.
And I really encourage anyone who's never been there to take a trip up there. Be sure you have at least a half a day, if not a whole day, to spend there, especially when they get the new visitor center open where you can look at exhibits and so forth, and travel across the battlefield and look at the wayside markers. One of the unique features of Little Bighorn is it's extremely pristine. And you have markers. It's the only battlefield in the world that has individual markers for soldiers, more or less where they fell. We know some of them are incorrect, but more or less where they fell and where they died on the battlefield. And then we also today have red markers where many of the warriors died on the battlefield. Not to mention, you have a mass grave of the soldiers that were killed there on top of the hill with their memorial, and nearby you have the Indian memorial that lists all the names and has some wonderful pictograph artwork in there, and a wonderful bronze sculpture that pays recognition to the three tribes that were fighting against Custer there in bronze form, in pictograph form. So I'll be honest with you, many days I would, after work, when the gates are closed, and I would say the battlefield is mine. And I would walk up there by myself and stand on Last Stand Hill and look at this beautiful panoramic view of the Valley of Little Bighorn, the river down below. Off in the distance to the south, you see the Bighorn Mountains. They're snow capped for much of the summer. Uh, and it's eerily full of energy. Uh, if you have an imagination as a human being, you cannot help but stand up there and feel the power of that place and that site. It's sacred ground, and many people have talked about that and written about it. But there's an energy there. Matter of fact, we sometimes say it's a place where ghosts walk in broad daylight. Because if you have an imagination, you can see those warriors fighting, you can see the soldiers dying, and you can see this happening in your own brain. So those are three things that I think are really important to remember when you go to Little Bighorn. And I believe that's one reason so many people from around the world like to come to this hillside. If there was a beautiful place to die, that's one of the places right there. Custer had an incredible view before he got blacked out with all the dust and smoke and so forth.
Interesting. All right, and we'll get to that later in different ways. Now, I wanted to start with looking at the battle itself. Up, let's see, where is that? Okay, so we're now going to focus in on the battle itself. And here is the map that was done by Paul Hedren in his book on the Great Sioux War. And what it is an overall map showing the whole area of operations, if you will. And I'm just wondering, just to start, Michael, what kind of comments you'd make about this picture here, this map of this whole
Yeah. Yeah,
area.
this is a great map with lots of good information in it. One of the things that people may or may not realize, they know that Custer fought at Little Bighorn, but it was just a one small action of the campaign of 1876, which was again supposed to be a winter campaign, which had proved successful for Sheridan and Sherman down on the southern plains in Oklahoma and Kansas. Uh, Unfortunately, it didn't get off till later. There's going to be three forces coming from three different directions. You see Montana Territory up there, and there's a place called Fort Ellis, and there's a guy named John Gibbon. The Indians call him No Hip Bone because he walked with a limp. Most people know John Gibbon from his fight at Gettysburg, but he'll leave Fort Ellis, one of the earlier guys to leave on the campaign, and he'll go along the Yellowstone River going towards the east with about 500 men, infantry and also cavalry, and he'll pick up some of the Crow Indian scouts along the way. From the south, from Wyoming Territory, you have Fort Fetterman down there, and you'll have George Crook with about 1,000 soldiers, along with some Crows and Shoshone scouts, and he'll move northward, looking for Sitting Bull's people in camp wherever it should be located. Of course, they're moving around. And then the third column, of course, is coming from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory, over there towards the middle of the map, upper middle. And that's, of course, going to be General Alfred Terry. He'll be the commander, again, because Custer gets in trouble with the Grant administration, as we talked about last week. And he's a subordinate of General Terry, who he was a Civil War veteran, although he had not much experience fighting Indians. But of course, George Custer and the 7th Cavalry will be under his command. And they will, of course, go westward. And what will eventually happen is, if you know anything about the campaign, we know that Crook will come up from the south, and on St. Patty's Day in 1876, a guy under his command by the name of Reynolds will attack a Cheyenne camp on the Powder River. And Hedron's done a great book on that Powder River battle. And anyway, that's going to basically um, kick off this campaign with the first bloodshed and first fighting. It was snowy and cold, and they'll capture the pony herd, but they will get their ponies back for the most part. Reynolds will eventually be court-martialed. One of the reasons for leaving some soldiers on the battlefield, which is going to get him in big trouble, he and some of the other subordinate officers. Uh, Crook will regroup, and of course, most people know that he will go forward and he will be on the Rosebud on the 17th of June, about a week before Custer has his fight. And it'll be a half a day battle. Um, the Indians call it the battle where the sister saved her brother, because in the middle of the battle, one of the warriors is shot off. His sister rides down on horseback and saves him. And both sides, by the way, 1,000 soldiers against about 1,000 warriors under Crazy Horse, back and forth, back and forth. And both sides look at it as they've won. Crook says he won it because he had the battlefield in his possession at the end of the day, in typical Civil War mentality. The warriors had gone back and forth, and they'd killed some of the soldiers, probably about 10. And we don't know exactly how many warriors were killed, but perhaps something about the same number. And but the Warriors look at it as a great victory, and they're going to celebrate. And one of the things that's important about that particular battle by Crook against Crazy Horse is that in that battle, the Warriors will do something that they will do later on at Little Bighorn very effectively, and that is they will break up the soldiers into small groups, small companies, and they'll pull them farther and farther and farther away from their supply train, from their ammunition, from the other soldiers. There was a ridge there called Comar Ridge, and a guy named Royal with some of the companies get lured. The Indians would hit him, they would chase him, they would hit him and chase him. And the wars got these guys extended way beyond their support, and they almost got wiped out there. And I think this is a rehearsal. I always talk about it being a rehearsal for Little Bighorn, because at Little Bighorn, the Warriors will do some of the same tactics very successfully. The one difference is they will fight more ferociously at Little Bighorn because their families are right across the river and in danger of these soldiers, which was not the case at the Battle of the Rosebud.
Okay, so let's
That's going to be the Battle of the Rosebud. Those are some of the things leading up. And then, of course, the third column, Gibbon and Terry and Custer will link up on the Yellowstone, and they will begin to make some decisions there.
yeah, we'll get into that in a moment here. Now, here, of course, is a Frederick Remington print, Boots and Saddles. And I would imagine that Custer's not, as I understand it, he orders, as the column moves south, he's ordering them not to use their bugles, obviously, to signal their presence. But here you have, and just let's lay out a little bit what's happening before this. So you have this scout that's done by Reno, uh, that is about what, four companies, six companies that do it before the battle.
He goes out and he takes his companies, and he actually goes along the waterways. As we mentioned last time, they knew the tribes would be somewhere along the waterways because they have to have water for their people and their horses. And Reno will go beyond where he's supposed to go, and he'll get in big trouble with Terry and with Custer. But reprimand him as they will allow him to stay with the command. The one thing that comes out of that disobedience of orders is they begin to find that the Indians are probably located on the Rosebud Creek. And so here's where Custer is given an independent command by General Alfred Terry. Terry decides he will, with Gibbon, go down the Bighorn, down to the Little Bighorn, and come from the north. They do not know where the Indian village is. They think it's somewhere in the valley of Little Bighorn, but they don't know for sure. It could still be on Rosebud Creek for all they know. And Custer's orders are to go down Rosebud Creek, go all the way to the headwaters, and come back up to the north. However, and this is always a great debate, many people say Custer disobeyed his orders, others say he didn't. It's my belief that Terry gives him a clause, an escape clause in there. It says, if you're so close to the enemy, I'm not going to restrict your movements. I have too much confidence in your zeal and energy. And so Terry gives him an out, and that's an out that Custer's anxious to take. And when he begins to follow the Indian Trail, which you see from the Yellowstone, by the way, Custer's going to order all of his ammunition and all of his food and supplies to be packed on pack mules. Unlike George Crook, who's an expert on packing mules, Custer's command is not. And they immediately, before they get out of camp on the first day, they begin to lose their provisions and things. And it becomes a constant headache for Custer all the way down Rosebud Creek. And he'll begin to go down Rosebud Creek following the Indian Trail. He will find abandoned Indian sites and Indian village sites. And again, no, like you said, there was no bugles. He wants to try to sneak up on this camp. As he begins to go down Rosebud Creek, he knows that he begins to notice that there's a lot of converging trails. And it's a mystery not only to the scouts and the soldiers, but there's lots and lots of people leaving the agencies, sometimes called summer roamers.
Hmm.
Warriors or people who would live on the reservation in the wintertime when it came spring and summer. They would go out and join up with the what we call the non-reservation Indians. Of course, the government used the other term hostile, but these again are people like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse going wherever they wanted to, basically following the buffalo herds and trying to live that traditional way of life. Custer's going to come on kind of on one village site. It's going to be very intriguing, and this is a story I always love to tell because it's so important to the native history. And that is Sitting Bull in early June will have at one of these sites, which is near what we call not too far from what we call the Deer Medicine Rocks, which is a very important religious site to the natives for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's still there. It's amazing because it's got pictographs on it. And one of the pictographs supposedly shows this vision of Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull has 50 pieces of skin cut from each arm, and he will sacrifice into a sun dance with a buffalo skull, and he will donate a buffalo to the Everywhere Spirit for a vision. And he will sing and dance with no food or water for over a day until he finally passes out, and he will relay this vision to his people at this particular site. And the vision from the Everywhere Spirit was soldiers are going to fall into our camp upside down.
Hmm.
And this meant to him that this is symbolic of the victory. And so the soldiers were going to attack his camp, fall upside down, and they will enjoy a big victory. However, there's something else that Sitting Bull tells his people that gets often neglected from the story. Sitting Bull also tells his people that witness the Sundance and are there in that camp, whatever you do when these soldiers die and fall into our camp, do not take their possessions. Leave them alone. Leave them on the battlefield. Do not take the spoils of battle. Otherwise, something terrible will happen to our people. And so the word spreads, and this is going to even be more. It makes the people that are joining Sitting Bull's camp even more confident that they can whip anybody they come up against. And but they realize that the Crook fight is not that fight because Crook didn't get into their camp. So one of the things that's said to this day, of course, is they took almost everything from the bodies against Sitting Bull's wishes, and they were punished by the Everywhere Spirit for those actions. One of the things that I like to tell people about Sitting Bull was a severe traditionalist. Not that he would not use a weapon from a white man like a repeating weapon, which he had, But one of the things that I think Sitting Bull witnessed as 1876 approaches, and he'd seen it happen for decades, is that more and more of his people were giving up traditional ways of living.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that, not living off the buffalo as much, not cooking in a buffalo stomach. Instead, going to the sutlers, going to the trading post and getting kettles and getting teacups and getting plates. They found these things in the abandoned camp down there. Of course, getting weaponry. Uh, and Sitting Bull is seeing more and more of a dependency by his people on the white man. And I think it really disturbs him. And whether you want to say it's subliminal or whatever, that becomes a very important part of his vision.
Interesting. Now, what I'm showing here is from the book Long Death by Ralph Andrus. This is a map showing the movement of forces up to the 25th of June. And you'll see up on the top of the map the conference on the Far West steamship on June 21st, where Terry and Custer are talking about the campaign. And at that point, uh, Terry offers him the cavalry that's accompanying Gibbon's column of several troops. And you also have here the whole issue of the Gatling guns,
Right.
which always, because I remember the first time I discovered it, I said, wait, he didn't take a machine gun down there with him? So what is your understanding now, based on all the different ways we have of understanding this, about those decisions? Because then, of course, you see further down here is where there's a map. The map shows the actual planned turn by Terry so that they would sweep further south than actually Custer did, because he picked up the trail sooner than any of them anticipated. But then the whole issue of coordinating the two columns coming in to the attack immediately after he is killed, after Custer's units is destroyed, is basically rendered combat ineffective, that becomes a big debate. That
It
Custer
does.
did not, he disobeyed orders. It was his recklessness. The colonel commanding the 7th Cavalry complains about that. So just go over those issues.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the donation of troops. One of the things many people don't realize that this is probably the first campaign. I think it is the first campaign where all 12 companies of the 7th Cav are actually together, because they had been spread out. Even at the Washita in the 1873 fights with the Indians, there were a lot of the different companies of the 7th that were doing reconstruction duty, or they were doing boundary duty, trying to find the Canadian border up there. Um, so Custer's very proud to have his unit together for the first time on a major campaign like this. And Terry's going to offer some second cav under Major Brisbane. And Brisbane wasn't a big fan of Custer's anyway. I can tell by some of the comments that he makes. But Custer says, no, I think morale wise, it'll be best if I just let the 7th Cav take care of this.
But excuse
And
me a second. Doesn't Brisbane say in a letter that he writes later afterwards that he refused to serve under Custer? That he was not, I mean, he says that I would not have served under him. I would only serve under you, General Terry. And if you decide to send Custer down there, I'm not going to go, or something like
yeah,
that.
well, I don't remember that specifically, that letter, but I do knew that he had some feelings about Custer that weren't very favorable. But of course, Terry's his commander, and Terry's gonna, if he says do it, he would have to do it. But Custer doesn't really want Brisbane along. And one of the things about the Gatling guns, there's been so many things written about the Gatling guns, and one of the things that most people don't realize is that Major Reno had taken him on his scout when he was looking for the tribes. He took the Gatling guns, and he had to abandon them in the field. They had to go back and get them because they were a pain. The terrain is extremely rugged, and it's like pulling a wagon. That's one reason why Custer didn't bring any wagons with him, because the terrain would have slowed everything up, trying to pull a wagon or a Gatling gun. And one of the things that I always ask people who say, well, he would have won the battle with a Gatling gun, is, well, how many Indian battles were ever won with a Gatling gun? And the answer is zero. Um, and there's some reasons for that. Number one, they're hard to maneuver around. The Gatling guns that they were using on this campaign did not rotate. Okay. And that's something I think we've watched way too many John Wayne movies like The War Wagon, things like that. This thing, you had to expose yourself to fire it. Took several people to fire it, and it would only fire in a straight line.
Mm.
So if you wanted to rake the area, you had to move the wheels. And that again is a difficult thing when you got 2,000 Indians shooting at you. But most people that know something about Gatling guns, and by the way, Reno told Custer, don't take them along. They're a pain in the booty. You don't want to bring them along. And also, I think it was Gerard, one of the scouts, says these guns are useless in fighting Indians. And of course, Terry had them. Terry had an opportunity, but again, he got slowed down by them. Uh, and the people, again, a lot of people and I think a lot of people like Terry and some of his subordinates, again, tried to cover their arses, so to speak, after the battle. They didn't know where the camp was, and one of the things I think it's important to remember: if Custer arrived a day early, then Terry arrived a day late, and that's something people forget. Because they're not they again they don't know where the village is. It could be anywhere in a large, expansive area. It could have been way down there in the Hook, and then Terry would have been a lot farther away that you show on your map here. But as Custer begins to follow this trail, as I mentioned, it gets closer, it gets wider and wider and wider. And what it does is it crosses over what's called Davis Creek there. And Custer makes a decision. And again, I think this is probably based on his experiences at the Washita. He's able to sneak up on the Washita village under the cover of darkness, and he's able to distribute his troops and hit the camp from several different angles. I think he's kind of got that in the back of his mind. You got to remember, this is only his second offensive movement against Indians. Second time he's fought them. Not totally, second time offensively he's fought them. And so his plan, evidently, according to everyone who's there with him, is that he sends up some Indian scouts up to a high place called the Crow's Nest, where they can look down Reno Creek and look down towards the Valley of Little Bighorn. And again, you can see this really great little dotted map here where he's following Davis Creek across through the divide, and you see the area where they, by the way, call it Sundance Creek rather than Reno Creek in this particular map. But see the crow's nest at the bottom. And Custer has his men ride during the night. He's trying to hide his troops from the possible discovery of Indians, trying to surprise the camp. And he puts them in a ravine. And then early morning, he will go up with his scouts and he will look down. The scouts are actually up there before Custer gets up there. And they see smoke and they see part of the pony herd about 12, 13 miles away from the crow's nest. And it's a big, big pony herd. And the trails are telling all the Indian scouts, both the Crows and the Rickards, that this is going to be a big camp. It's going to be a heck of a fight if you're able to engage them. Custer's plan, according to talking to his officers later that morning, was he was going to hide his troops over there and during the night was going to sneak up around the village, dispose of his troops around the camp, and attack on the 26th of June. That was his plan. But when he's on the crow's nest up there, he will find out from several of his troops that they have most likely been discovered. There's Indians behind them, following them. They've dropped some hardtack or some clothing on the trail. During the night, they go back and they see warriors, Cheyennes around it, by the way. They shoot at the Cheyennes. The Cheyennes escape. They also see a young boy and his grandfather looking for horses. They try to kill them, but they're going to escape down the creek towards the village. At least the young boy will not survive, but the grandfather will, to be able to give a few minutes warning to the
This is
village.
Crawler and Deeds down here on the
Yeah,
map.
this speech, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then he sees this Black Bear's Bando Oglala. Is that,
That's true. Yeah, he sees
or they
these
see him?
yeah, they see him, yeah. You see his troops and they got the campfires going over there in the morning, early in the morning. And so Custer at this point has a big discussion. Some people call it a fight up on top of the crow's nest. He's getting these messages, mixed messages. You better not attack. It's a huge village. And then some of the Crow scouts begin to argue. One of the Arikras hears the Crow Scouts condemning Custer for not going ahead. And you don't hear this much in the Crow history, but it's talked about by the Arikras that it was either half yellowface or it was maybe white man runs him. He says, Custer, we've been spotted. It'll be a mistake to sit out here and wait. You've got to attack now. And Custer argues back and forth. No, we're going to wait. We're going to wait. We're going to wait. And this is something you rarely hear in the stories or even some of the really good books on Little Bighorn. But the Crow Scouts twist Custer's arm to a degree, and he says, "Okay, I better do as you suggest." And so Custer will ride fairly quickly down Reno Creek, and of course he will divide his troops as he goes down Reno Creek.
Now here we have the approach to the crow's nest is a little bit before this. Here you having sightings of Sioux from crow's nest. This is actually preceding this on the 24th into the 25th. And here down in the bottom of this map, this is from the Army's official history of the Sioux Wars. This is the planned regimental hide position that he's going to take and hide. And the other question I have for you is the combat readiness of the 7th Cavalry. In Paul Hedren's book, he makes a big emphasis about how most of the officer corps is quite experienced. There's many of them are Civil War veterans, etc. So they've been through Indian wars. He also refers to the non-commissioned officers as also having a high substantial number of Civil War veterans also experienced. But then you get into the enlisted ranks, and you have this whole issue of the recruits being taken in, just to particularly the units that are coming in from the south that are sent to reinforce to make the whole regiment whole with 12 companies. And then the issue of marksmanship, which you have raised. I know that there's good scholarship about the NRA, if I recall, is created as a result of poor marksmanship in the Civil War, that some guys weren't hitting those targets. But what is the state of that whole question of the combat effectiveness of the unit? We know from all the kind of studies that we've done since World War II, it's a pretty well-established kind of way to set up a combat unit. But you do need a certain hardcore. And then, of course, people in World War II had basic training and advanced infantry training that they used their weapons well. So what's the status of the average soldier in the 7th Cavalry in terms of knowing how to use weapons, knowing the tactics, having an understanding about fighting Indians?
Yeah. And Jim, you hit it right on the head. The officer corps, they were mostly all veterans, had fought in the Civil War and had some experience fighting the Indians. Not a lot, but a little. The enlisted men themselves, of course, about 25% have been in the service. I think less than a year. There were a lot of rookies, so to speak, that probably didn't ride real well. Obviously, they didn't fire real well because none of these guys, except for some of the officers, were pretty good marksmen. Custer was supposed to be a heck of a shot, but there's a funny thing that happens on the way out on Reno Scout, which kind of is something that's talked about. I think it was Dr. DeWolf, one of the civilian doctors, has a shooting competition with two of the non-commissioned officers and outshoots both of them. And I've always thought that was kind of interesting that you had a civilian doctor who was a better shot than some of the non-commissioned officers there. Yates, before the battle, is complaining that he doesn't have enough ammunition for his men to practice with and offers to actually take money out of his paycheck where his company can be better marksmen. But it just wasn't the case for most of these guys. You also have some language barriers, and I've mentioned this perhaps before. You have 13% of the 7th Cav. And by the way, 40% of the Indian Wars Army is immigrants. A lot of immigrants, people coming, can't find a job during the Panic of 1873, as we mentioned the last time. And the way they're surviving is to hold up your hand, and you get paid $13 a month. You get a uniform and you get 3 meals a day, although sometimes those meals weren't very good. But you're expected to be a part of this regiment. And 13% were, I think 14% were Irish, and 13% were Germans. And there's several instances in this battle where you hear stories about that the soldiers didn't speak English very well. A great example, of course, is Giovanni Martini, who's going to be ironically Custer's last or the only surviving messenger, the last one of the last people to see Custer alive. The note is going to be written down on a piece of paper and handed to him by a very perceptive adjutant, W. Cook, who's a Canadian. You've got August Finkel, who's got a strong, I think, a German background, and the men are always making fun of the way that he speaks English. So you have some of those things happening. Also, so you got lots of different languages being spoken. You've got probably German being spoken, Irish being spoken, and then you've got people from other countries all over Europe. Um, so that's going to be part of it. I think one of the interesting things that I just read a chapter in a book the other day. It's a fairly new book. Were Custer's men ready to fight? And his conclusion was that they were ready to go. And I think no doubt they were tired. Um, I think one of the things that happens is people have complained that Custer drove his troops too quickly down Rosebud Creek, but they were used to traveling over about that much territory in a day, anywhere from 20 to 30 miles a day. So it wasn't like they were completely wearing out their horses, although I'm sure their horses were tired. The night march was kind of tough on the soldiers because they only got a couple of hours of sleep that night. They had breakfast that morning, but as they go into battle, they don't have lunch. And so you've got men about to go into a fight that are haven't had lunch. Number one, they're in the saddle riding as quickly as they can. Um, this is something that's interesting to me. There's a soldier who leaves in Medicine Tail Coulee with one of the horses, probably right after John Martin leaves. His name is Bates. And Bates is told by his commanding officer, take Custer doesn't want these extra horses going into the battle. And he tells a couple of these guys to take the horses by these officers and get them away. And one of the things that's said to Custer, to Yates, to this particular enlisted man who's taking the horse out of the battle is, and by the way, when you get back to the pack mules, get the cooks up here as quickly as you can where we can feed the men. Now, you've never read that in any book. It will be in an article that I'm writing before too long. But one of the things that's interesting about that particular story is as Custer's going into the fight, he's thinking about the welfare of his men.
Hmm. Interesting.
And that interesting, and on a human level, we kind of ignore that sometimes, but Custer's thinking about that. One of the things that's also happening, you got to remember that these men are on an adrenaline high. They are coming down Reno Creek. The soldiers are joking back and forth with one another. What are we going to do with Sitting Bull when we get him? Once we capture him, let's take him back to the World's Fair with us.
Oh,
You know, take us
really?
back.
Wow.
Oh yeah, they're talking about taking him back to the Centennial campaign, the Centennial celebration in Philadelphia. When they get up on top of the hill and they see the village for the first time, all of these men begin to cheer. They all begin to throw their hats in the air. And then the men are so excited they begin to get in front of Custer and race down the ravine towards the river. Custer has to scream at them, "Hold your horses! There's enough men. There's enough warriors down there for all of us." Even though he's just seen this village kind of in a peaceful state because he snuck up on the whole village.
Interesting. Now
These are
here, I just want to, yeah, yeah, go on.
you got these guys that are pumped up. So to think that they're all going in there and they're all whooped and they're all tired, I think is not a very truthful statement.
Interesting. Now here you have the most, actually one of the most controversial aspects of this whole battle, and that is the division of the regiment to attack. Now, many years ago, when I began to pay attention to this, I said, well, wait a minute, like, of course, they were defeated in detail. But I didn't realize the nature of Indian war fighting, that it was sort of standard operating procedure to divide your forces into different columns and essentially envelop a village, take the objective of the pony herds and seize them as fast as possible so you immobilize the Indians. But explain this decision making here. What because everybody battles about this. And you see that immediately in the post battle arguments in the press by the army, by the Democratic newspapers will support Custer. Republican newspapers will attack Custer over these kind of decisions. So just start here with the division of the regiment into columns and your take on that.
Yeah. It's fascinating, and I've read I read so many books about this little trek down what we call Sundance or Reno Creek, and it's always fascinating to me because uh, Custer is relying on again experience. And when did he sneak up on a village and successfully attack a village? At the Washita. So to think that breaking up your troops into smaller groups and hitting a village from various sides would be totally unacceptable is kind of an insane notion because he used it, Mackenzie used it, several other people used it. It was used at the Powder River fight, breaking up the soldiers into different groups and hitting the village from different angles and so forth. So this is not some kind of crazy idea of breaking your troops into smaller groups and attacking a force. Um, One of the things that gets ignored, and I haven't, it's, I bring it up in my book where the rivers ran red, and I don't know if it's ever brought up by anybody else in any other book, believe it or not. And that is along the Republican River in Custer's early fighting career. And this is before he actually fights at the Washita. I think this is happening right before the Hancock campaign, which wasn't very successful for Custer. He does exactly the same exact thing. Uh, he breaks up his forces along the Republican River. He doesn't know where the Indians are into four different battalions, and he marches along an area of terrain. It's kind of a seek and destroy mission. And if any of these different commands run into the Indians, they're supposed to let the other nearby battalions know what's going on where they can all be involved. So what you're seeing here is the same exact tactic that Custer has used previously. Although again, I don't think you'll find it in any other books, but he does do this before. And he almost gives the same exact instructions to Benteen and Reno. Uh, First, he gets out there, and Benteen is supposed to be taking the advance, by the way, and because he's pretty excited about that. And we've talked a little bit about the animosity between Benteen and Custer. But there's some rough terrain up there. Custer's seen this terrain as best he can see from the crow's nest, which is nearby, and he knows it's got to be pretty rough. But he sits there and he breaks up his command into basically four groups. He has a Benteen taking three companies. He has Reno taking three companies. He has Keogh taking three companies, and he has Yates taking two companies. And the Keogh and the Yates company stay together, and Custer decides to ride along with them. And you can see Sundance Creek in the middle of the map there. And you'll see he orders Benteen off to the left. By the way, with instructions to go all the way to the valley. If you see any Indians, pitch into them. In other words, bring them to battle and let me know immediately. Now, that's kind of fascinating to think about. He's sending three companies towards these Indians wherever they are. They haven't seen the village yet, but if you see them, fight them and let me know. Okay. He's going to give the same exact orders to Reno a little bit later on when they get closer to the river. Again, they haven't seen the village yet, but he's going to tell Reno to go forward, attack any Indians or any village. There's a big battle about the nomenclature there, but to fight whatever's in front of you, and you'll be supported by the rest of the regiment. So basically, Custer's going to give Benteen orders to fight. He's going to give Reno orders to fight, and he's going to be nearby, ready to react to the situation. One of the things that many people ignore about Custer's tactics is many times he made decisions instantaneously. He actually talks about that. He did it in the Civil War. He does it in the Indian Wars as well. He reacts to situations as they occur, and he does a fairly decent job of doing that, by the way. So people don't like to hear me say this sometimes because they want Custer to have a distinct battle plan as he comes down Reno Creek. But it's obviously he's kind of flying by the seat of his pants to a degree. He's going to let things develop. Number one, he doesn't know where the village is for sure. He doesn't know the size of the village. All he's seen are these Indian trails, which he's following as he goes down towards the Little Bighorn River there.
Interesting. Now, one thing I just wanted to throw in is the sort of mentality of how he's estimating his foe going in here. Hedgeron, in his book, Great Sioux War Order of Battles, starts off with an actually remarkable number. I never saw this before. That Sheridan, when the campaign begins, and I'm quoting, he estimates that Sitting Bull has 70 warriors and that Crazy Horse has 200. Now, after the battle, of course, when you read the accounts by Lieutenant became General Godfrey, who is one of the survivors of the battle, they start putting out numbers of 6,500 warriors and all this. So, what in your mind at this time is his thinking about what is he? He doesn't know what is. He doesn't know about the Battle of Rosebud. He doesn't know what happened to Crook's column. What in your mind is his thinking about what he's coming up against in terms of numbers here? Or given his record in the Civil War, because he is an intuitive combat commander.
Right.
There's an incident of him fighting where he's ordered by Kilpatrick to directly assault an artillery battery, and he says, "No, no, I'm not going to do it yet." And
Yes.
he poses, he keeps the cavalry underneath and out of sight of the Confederates, waits for them to reload, and as they're reloading, he assaults them and takes the battery. So he has that intuitive combat sense of looking for the right moment to strike. But what is his estimate in your mind coming into this fight about what he's facing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. I think quite often people ignore some of the information. It's come out in several different books, but they're thinking they may run in maybe 800 warriors. Uh, However, they also are getting rumors before they leave Fort Abraham Lincoln that there's lots and lots of people leaving the reservation.
The summer roamers.
Summer roamers, they're beginning to leave. And what's really fascinating is when you begin to read Woodenleg, Woodenleg's got an amazing account of what happens almost day by day.
Tell
Uh,
people who Wooden Leg is.
Woodenleg is a Cheyenne warrior. He's a young guy, about 18 years of age, at Little Bighorn. And Woodenleg he's a big, tall guy. Uh, he was almost 6'4", a very intimidating specimen. But he does great maps along with Thomas Marcus, which is a doctor who recorded his accounts. There's a book that came out called A Warrior Who Fought Custer, and it's the story of Woodenleg. But anyway, he's giving these accounts of what's happening, how the village is growing each day, all these different bands. It starts out with just the Ungpapas and the Oglalas, those two different bands. And then before long, you've got the Brulés and you got the Sanzark. You got some Blackfeet Lakota coming in. You got the mini Kanju. You just got all these different bands that are beginning to appear and show up. And that's probably one of the best ideas of how the village is growing as it goes down Rosebud Creek all the way over to Little Bighorn. However, General Terry's getting these official reports from the agencies about all these people leaving. And before Custer leaves Fort Abraham Lincoln, they are talking figures of 1,500 warriors could be a number that he could meet at Little Bighorn, or not Little Bighorn, could meet somewhere on this campaign. Of course, he will meet probably about that many. 1,500 to maybe 2,000 warriors is what we use as Park Service numbers from our research there. Maybe a village size of 6 to 8,000 people total. And there's a great debate about that. But again, I think before Custer leaves, he's anticipating that he could run into 1,500 warriors. Now, that doesn't mean a lot to Custer. Again, he's in his fights, his three Indian fights, he's taken very few casualties. And so in his mindset, he's going to be using, as you know, symmetrical warfare tactics. He's going to be using skirmish lines. He's going to have horse holders. which depletes 25% of each company. He's got companies that are understaffed. There's supposed to be 80 men in the company. However, he only has about 40. So he's understaffed as far as enlisted men. Um, he's going to be fighting an asymmetrical warfare there. He's going to be fighting guerrilla style fighters that are some of the best in the world. And the thing Custer hated most in the Civil War was asymmetrical warfare from people like Mosby. It frustrated the hell out of Custer. And that's why I talked last week a little bit about these different psychological tactics he's using with some of these tribes, especially after the Washita. But having said that, that's the way these soldiers fight, and that's the way they're trained to fight. There's great rules and discipline on how you're supposed to dismount, how you're supposed to link up your horses. All this is a given. On flat ground, you've got an advantage if you're a soldier with a Springfield carbine because you got range and accuracy on your side, even if you're not a very good shot. You can throw out a lot of lead and you keep the Indians far back from you. But that's not going to happen on Custer's side of the river. When he begins to fight on those hills, the terrain is going to be a major player. It's going to diffuse the ability for those skirmish lines to function effectively. Reno will take one casualty. He has 90 men firing Springfield carbines on flat ground. He takes one casualty against 400 to 600 warriors. So those tactics work on the right terrain.
Now, when he divides a regiment, what approximate time is that when he starts this assault on the village?
I believe it's earlier than most scholars. And you're going to see lots of timetables out here. And there's no, I'll be honest with you, there is no real consensus on when the battle started. I believe the warriors, and they said it had happened about midday. I think that the battle probably happened at Reno's fight began probably 12:30 to 1 o'clock. In the old days, the Park Service said it started at 3 o'clock, ended at 5 o'clock, but that's way too late in the afternoon. And having done rides along Reno Creek or Sundance Creek, knowing how fast Custer was traveling, I think it was Reno or John Martin said they left the divide at 10 o'clock. The others said it was 11 o'clock. Others say it was 12 o'clock. So you've got no real consensus on exactly when they left the divide.
Have you ridden this route on
I
horseback?
have. I've ridden Benteen's Scout to the left out there to see what that terrain was like. And it is rough, by the way. And you can see Custer's command two times from those high hills over there. As Godfrey talks about, they could see Custer's men at a trot going down the river, making a lot of noise, he said, which is interesting. But yeah, I'm out there, and I'm one of the guys who kind of found where the morass is as well.
Oh,
There's
really?
a lot of debate about that, and I found a photograph by Walter Camp who took some of those soldiers out there, and he photographed it, and I was able to match the photograph by Walter Camp, and because there's even been debate about where the morass is. Of course, there's a lot of debate about the lone teepee. They fall upon a lone teepee on the trail as well, a dead warrior from the Battle of the Rosebud, a Sanzark, and so there's a lot of things they encounter as they go down there. But Benteen's going to go out there to the left. He'll be frustrated. At first, he thinks he's in good shape. He's going to be in the battle. Before long, he begins to realize this is kind of a wild goose chase out here. No Indian with the brain would have any idea of wanting to stay out in this kind of terrain. That's one of the comments that he makes, by the way. And then Reno's going to go on the left side of the creek, almost parallel to Custer as they go down. And of course, Custer's eventually going to go down to where the lone teepee is. And this lone teepee, he calls Reno across the river. By this time, they're beginning to see warriors in front of them that were camped out, by the way, near that lone teepee. They find fires there and stuff. Custer has the teepee torched, by the way. And he has a big battle with his Arikara scouts there. The Arikaras are supposed to go ahead and stampede any Indian ponies ahead of to dismount the warriors, but that doesn't really happen. And Custer's angry about that. Step one in his plan fails right there because the Arikaras are hesitant about going across and trying to stampede all these horses. And it would have been an impossible task anyway. There was probably anywhere from 40 to over, some people say 10 to 40,000 ponies up on top of the
Wow.
bluffs
That
near the
man,
hill.
wow. And what's the time distance between when he divides the regiment to when you see on this map they actually move in different directions, the two columns. Custer's column, when the map says causes Custer pauses to water horses. What is the time distance in your estimate of time do you think that takes to them to get there?
It's 12 miles.
12
Okay.
miles.
12 miles from the divide to the river there. That's how far that distance is. Okay. You can walk, listen to this, you can walk a horse 4 miles an hour. Okay. So he trots his horses. He doesn't walk his horses down that creek. So that kind of gives you an idea if they're trotting, they could probably get down towards that river fairly quickly.
So
Um,
probably an hour at
Probably an hour, maybe a little more than an hour. It depends again. They're kind of stopping and going as well. They're not just riding at a gallop or a trot all the way down the creek.
so again,
Uh,
it's hard to tell what time it is, but let's say if it takes about an hour, hour and a half, so it's maybe you said you figure they start, he divides the regiment around 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Is that correct? Sometime around,
that's what the official timeline is. I
I
believe
think
it's
it's earlier.
I think it's earlier than that. I think they're down there ready to attack around 12:30 to 1, sometime like that.
Okay, so at this point, we're talking about they're probably up here somewhere between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At the
Exactly.
okay, so at this point, and this is a map showing this in the official history of the Army, and how they're moving up to the point that we see here, the morass, a little more detailed. This is the map done out of Sioux Atlas. You can get this at the OCMH website, the Office of the Chief of Military History website, a little more detailed. They use it for staff rides, obviously. Now, again, what's going on in the camp? What's going on in the Indian camp? Because you also have the 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 crawler in deeds. You have the party that stumbles across them. What do we know that's going on in the Indian camp? Is there alertness about what's happening here with these troops?
Yeah, the Indian village the night before had been doing a lot of celebrating over the victory over Crook that they looked at as a victory. They're having dances. They're having social dances for the young people. Wooden Leg talks about it. Here's this young teenage boy wanting to meet somebody outside the Cheyenne Circle. And so he goes to the Sanzark camp next door and talks about partying all night with and dancing with the Sioux girls and so forth. So there's, it's like a family reunion. You got people that are coming in from the reservations. They're getting to see their families that they haven't seen in a long time. Uh, they're looking for. This is a huge village, so they're having to look for food. Uh, One of the reasons why they turned and went down to the north down the valley is that they saw a huge antelope herd the day before because they were going to go back towards the Bighorn Mountains. But with seeing these antelope, they decided this would be a great food supply. And they're killing buffalo along the trail as well, because Custer's going to see skinned buffalo as he comes down Reno Creek. They talk about that. But there's dancing, there's celebrations. As a matter of fact, if you read almost every Indian account, not every, but almost every warrior account, and even accounts of the women, they're out digging wild turnips, they're gathering food. They're most of the warriors are sleeping in. They were woke up when the gunfire began. The horses are up on the cliffs over there on the bluffs that are in this particular map. Further down they're off the map at the bottom, but that huge pony herd is down there. A few ponies are down in the village, obviously, but the huge herd is up on top grazing. But you've got a lot of people sleeping in, and that's what's in Greg Micknow's book called A Code of Noon has all those different accounts, and he has a whole chapter on how surprised the Indian village was, and he does a really good job of talking about those different accounts and what each different warrior who was recorded later on said was happening. A lot of the people were swimming. It was hot. It was going to be 93 degrees the day of this fight. We know that from some of the temperatures on the far west, which is 14 miles away. That's how hot it got. It was a hot day. And so a lot of people are swimming and they're playing in the water in the river down there. We know that Crazy Horse is going to be in the river taking a bath, I think, down there when he has to go to his teepee and get ready for combat. So you've got people milling around, and it's not until um, you've got Deeds and his grandfather. Some people call him Brownback. Brownback is literally going to come riding down into the camp. And this is a massive camp. It's a mile and a half long, so they don't have walkie-talkies. It takes a little while for this information to get to the other teepees and other circles. Deeds will be killed, as you know, kind of up there close to Fort A, which is on your map. And we don't know exactly who killed him. No one ever admitted to killing that young guy up there. But there's also some warriors that were camping out at the lone teepee, and they scamper. Some of them probably go up on the bluffs. Some of them go across the river. And Reno, as he begins to approach the ford, begins to see a lot of dust kicked up from these warriors. Gerard sees them from the lone teepee. So there go your Indians running like the devil. And there was parties of warriors that were camped out down there, and they began to head towards the village. So you've got these people coming into the village. Custer and Reno are not going to wait very long. They're going to hit the village very quickly. They hit it so quickly that most of the warriors don't have time to get their horses right away. It takes them a while to get their ponies. And that's why Reno's confronted with not so many warriors at the very beginning of his skirmish line. Takes them a while to get their ponies and their horses.
Now, one thing in here, I guess, is the timing that the military folks that did this at Fort Leavenworth, this atlas. I guess you would dispute the times that they're arguing for the skirmish lines. You would probably say they're an hour earlier, right? Because
Yeah,
they're arguing here they're at 15:33. Uh, the timing must be at least an hour earlier in your estimates, correct?
yeah, I think they're much earlier than people. Again, I believe that the Warriors watered their ponies at midday, and most of them said the sun was right above us. You know, one of the things that we have a tendency to rely on, and I know the military relies on it, Wallace was the official timekeeper. And he says that they left the divide, I think, around lunchtime, around noon. So I think, and by the way, they did not have time zones in 1876. Wallace's watch is on what we call St. Paul time during this time period. Other people are using what they call sun time. And Wagner brings this up in his book, Strategy of Defeat, that they're using different times. There's not time zones, but they're using different times. They're using either the time where the sun is in the sky or they're relying on St. Paul time. So that's why you have such confusion. Like the night before, Wallace says that they left at midnight, where all the other soldiers said they left at 11. So there's a discrepancy between the times. And but the main thing is they didn't dawdle down that trail. As they began to come down that trail, Custer was in a hurry, and he's trying to get down there as quickly as he can. And I think sometimes if you begin to look at Gray's analysis and Micknow's analysis and Wagner's analysis, they have way too much time. And I don't think a lot of these guys, I know Gray didn't, they never rode horses out there to see how fast you can move to point A from point B. And
That's
having done that many times, and by the way, these military groups don't do that either.
all right. Okay.
I would like to challenge them to get on a horse and ride down Reno Creek and see how long it takes. Now the pack mules is another situation. The pack mules are moving slower.
Well,
Okay.
also, what's interesting to me is the debate about the size of the encampment itself, because I guess most agree that the Unkpapas were sort of, from the point of view of the first circle to be attacked, were attacked, and then you have the deployment of the different circles: Blackfeet, Brule, Two Kettles, Miniconjous, Sanzarks, and Cheyennes. But then the issue is how long the camp is, because you say it's about a mile and a half in your estimate. And then
We know that.
sometimes I see these estimates, it's 3 miles long or 4 miles long, and then after the battle, Godfrey's claiming that Sitting Bull said he had 6,500 warriors himself. So again, you get into this issue of are you going to overestimate the size of the force that defeated you because you want to sort of minimize perhaps your errors or what? But explain it a little bit about, because this map doesn't really show. Here, Reno's coming in with a assault, a charge. So, what happens to Reno when he launches these three companies? And on the left flank, you don't see this, but I guess there are scouts on the left flank.
Yeah.
Uh,
Let me answer your other question real
yeah.
quickly. When I came to work as a park ranger, historical interpreter back in 1987, it was um, all the park literature handed out the gate. Almost every book that I picked up and read had the village as being 3 miles long.
Mm,
It started right there where you have your map where the Hungpapa Circle is next to what we call the Gary Owen Loop. And it went all the way down below Last Stand Hill. And they would show this massive village of 3 miles. And it was just, it's like so many things about this battle. It just, things are said for so often and so long and so many times that people begin to believe it is absolute truth. And me included when I first came there. And then I started doing more and more and more research and began to realize there's a really simple answer. And the answer is Woodleg describes the village in great detail, circle by circle. What happened was after the battle on the 25th, that evening, one of the things that the villagers did not do is they did not want to have their camp where there were dead and dying people. Okay. So what they did was they relocated their camp to the north. They shifted it. And by the way, there's a map in Woodleg's book that shows exactly where they moved to. They moved from where they were at the time of the battle to adjacent to where they were. So if it's a mile and a half village, guess what? It looks like when you come in there a few days later with General Terry, you're going to go over 3 miles of debris.
mm,
What Terry's actually looking at is he's looking at remains and teepee poles and things from two different camping spots. And that's made very clear in Woodleg's book. However, the military, from the military standpoint, there's a reason why we got our butts kicked. Is because it was a huge village and there were lots and lots of warriors. Matter of fact, Benteen would calculate there were 10 to 12,000 warriors there. He makes Godfrey's estimate even small because that's the only way the seventh could be kicked was because they had so many warriors and it was such a huge camp. So they began this own propaganda thing happening right after the battle to protect their own regimental reputation for the most part. So you say, well, Donahue, how do you know this? Well, the map book that I did, it's got a whole section on every Indian map that I could find in existence.
mm.
And people keep sending me maps, which is fantastic. I always love that. That's why I had to do a revision. I got another 15 maps that have never been seen by folks. But what you'll notice is they will show almost every Indian map will have a layout of the Indian village, and it'll show the river and it'll show where things happened. And almost every one of the Indian maps shows the village as being a mile and a half long at the time of the fight. So who knows better than the Indians how big the village was?
Now, one thing is that, I'm just showing quickly, we're going to get back to this in a moment. So here, of course, is the assault of Reno coming in. And what time do you estimate that was, according to your timeline? When is
Again, I think sometime between 12:30 and 1 is when it actually started.
12:31? Okay. So here you have this communications going back and forth in this Army explanation of this time period. Boston Custer meets Martin. I assume that's Giovanni Martini.
Yes,
Boston Custer was the youngest brother, right?
yes.
Uh,
Younger
so,
brother, civilian, hired on as a civilian
right,
contractor.
because he had his whole family there. And then you
Right.
have Mitch Boyer, who's a scout with Curly, the Crow Scout. Boston Custer arrives. Now they're timing this around 15, 30 hours. You would estimate, is this occurs, should be 14, 30 hours? Or,
Yes.
okay. So to explain what that is all about, all
Actually,
this,
earlier than that, I think again, we're talking 12:30 military time. What would that be? 12 would be 12:30, wouldn't it?
right, right. And
Not 15. That's again, this is talking, they're talking about 3 o'clock. This is really, really old time estimates.
all right, and then you have Sergeant Knipp who reaches Benteen with the bring up the packs order about 1540. Is that accurate, or do you think that's an hour earlier? 14, is it 1440 for that order?
Yeah, again,
You're not sure.
I discount all of these.
Okay.
I don't I don't agree with any of these times.
All right. Explain what's happening up here. Who are these back
Yeah.
and forth messages going on here?
Well, let's go back a little bit further back. We talked about the lone teepee there, and we know at the lone teepees when Custer's going to give an order to Reno to go forward and attack any Indians to his front, which we see happening here. And we also know that at this point, the Arikars will go along with Reno as he begins to advance towards the river. Again, you can see that right there with the Reno Custer thing. Custer's going to fall behind Reno. By the way, as Reno begins to head out, Lieutenant Varnum, who is one of the chief of scouts, comes back after Reno leaves and goes up to Custer and said, "Hey, I've been up ahead and I've looked down the valley and I can actually see teepees. I can see that there's a pretty large village down there. Some of it's blocked, of course, by trees and timber." So Custer, this is the first earliest time that he's heard that, hey, by the way, there is a standing village in the valley, about right there where the name Custer shows up in the map there. Uh, for whatever reason, there's no indication that he tells Reno that at all,
Ah,
that he communicates to Reno. So Reno is going across the river looking for Indians, village, whatever's in front of him. He's told to attack it, and he'll be supported by the rest of the regiment. And of course, Reno thinks Custer's going to come behind him. There's other indications that Custer may come behind him. Uh, uh, Captain Keogh and W. Cook ride all the way to the river with Reno and watch him cross. And one of the comments by those two is that, yes, Keogh, we're bringing our company and we're going to go with the advance. In other words, we're going to go with you, Reno. What what Keogh and Cook don't know, evidently, is that Custer is stopped. He stopped back here where it's an area right there before he gets to the river. And by the way, in the 1960s, there's some property down there, and I knew the landowner's name was Eshelman. Mr. Eshelman, a real nice guy. And he let me know that up until the 1960s, there was a freshwater spring right next to his property there. And evidently, that's where Custer probably watered his horses.
right there on that map there.
Yeah. By the way, that spring is no longer there. When they were dynamiting for the road and stuff in there, that spring dried up. But you can see the remnants of it there. So we're almost certain where Custer waters his horses there. And by the way, right above that is a ravine. It takes you right up to what we know as Sharpshooter Ridge and the Reno Benteen site later on.
So you're arguing that Keogh was down there with Reno and
Yeah,
saying he's going to have these two companies to support him.
yeah, he thinks he's coming. This is Keogh's first Indian fight, by the way. So anyway, but Keogh and these guys don't know that Custer stopped to water his horses. And this is an intriguing thing that happens while he's watering his horses. I think it's an extremely important thing that gets left out of the story quite often. As they're watering the horses, and Martin says this for 5 or 10 minutes down there. Again, these horses have been riding pretty hard, and they get down there and they're probably pretty thirsty. Uh, as they're sitting there watering their horses, uh, Martin notices something. He notices it, and it gets pointed out to Custer that there's travois trails going up to the right towards the bluffs. In other words, there's been non-combatants. There's part of the trail of the Indians going up to the top of the bluffs there. Women and children have traveled up to the top of those bluffs. He also, when he looks up there, Daniel Kanipe looks up to those bluffs, which we probably know as Sharpshooter Ridge today. It's a big high peak. And he sees 40 or 50 Indians watching them down there. So here's Custer watering his horses. Reno's gone on in advance. He looks over, sees a trail of where the Indian trail goes up to the bluffs up there where they had crossed downstream somewhere. And he sees 40 or 50 warriors. Now, as he's sitting there watering his horses, one of the things Custer has to be concerned about is his pack mules and all of his ammunition are behind him. And when he looks up there and sees these 40 or 50 warriors, he doesn't know if there's 40 or 50 or whether there's 1,000 over that hill. So in typical Custer style, He follows that travoy trail up to the top of the bluffs and straight towards those warriors. He cannot allow, and I think this is really important, he cannot allow those warriors, how many there are, to get between him and his supply train with his ammunition. He cannot let that happen. I think this is a really important thing to bring up because a lot of people ignore this. I think Custer again is making a decision. He hadn't seen the village yet. He's making a decision based on what's happening right before his very eyes.
Interesting.
He's
So there you get into a situation where he decides to protect the pack train. He doesn't inform Reno. Reno's in the middle of charging with three companies, but he makes a decision on the spot, from your interpretation, to protect the pack train because he doesn't want to lose his ammunition.
exactly because
It,
at the Washita, by the way, at the Washita, he almost loses his butt at the Washita because his his wagons with the ammunition are cut off from him when the Indian attack begins.
well, that
So
raises a simple question. We know that each trooper is carrying what, 50 rounds?
got 100 rounds of carbine and
100.
24 revolver.
What's back in the pack train in
Oh,
terms of ammunition?
I think they have over 40,000 rounds back there.
40,000. Both pistol and rifle ammunition. Okay.
They've got lots of it back there. And by the way, they're packed on different mules than the other supplies.
Interesting. So that, yeah, that is all I think when you start saying they're packed in different ways, I think about how you pack a combat transport ship in World War II to land. So
Yeah.
it would mean, so it's interesting, how's the pack train organized? Is it well organized to actually bring the ammo up quickly? Is the
No, it's
ammo?
not. Matter of fact, it's a nightmare. As Benteen finally gets frustrated, he will come up to the to what's called a morass to water his horses, and he will sit there for about say 20 minutes and water his horses. Um, as he begins to leave, and by the way, the other officers, Godfrey and Weir, are with him.
This is the
And
morass, by the way, that Custer encounters, right?
they both he and Reno passed this earlier. They didn't stop to water anything though. But you see Reno coming up the morass there. And as he comes up the morass, he sees Boston Custer, who's gone back to the pack train to get another fresh horse. He passes him and waves and stops and talks to the officers for a few minutes, which is pretty fascinating because we know that Boston Custer is going to actually die with George Custer and he's going to get into the battle. So we know that probably from the timing here that Benteen is going to be there at the watering spot for at least 20 minutes. And a lot of people are getting agitated. Cap, especially Weir, says, why is the old man waiting here for so long? Because they know that there's going to be some activity probably in front of them. And Weir actually takes the advance, and it pisses Benteen off, and Benteen charges out and takes the lead again away from Weir. And this is about the time when he's leaving the morass that the first messenger comes past, riding past Benteen, and it's Daniel Knight, verbal message that they need to bring up the pack mules. And he also kind of gives the illusion to Benteen that they're kicking their butts down there. And of course, Knight has not seen any of the battle at all. He doesn't even see Reynolds charge, by the way. So there we get some timing elements going on there. When Benteen later on gets to the watering spot where Custer's already, he's gone away from that area and gone up towards the bluffs. And this is again probably 20 minutes later, probably. This is where he encounters John Martin with the very famous message that says, Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs, ampersand, bring packs. And in other words, he wants Benteen to be sure and protect the pack mules and get them over here in a hurry.
Now, in relationship to what we're going to talk about right now with Reno's assault, when he reaches the place on this creek where he's watering his horses, where it says Custer pauses to water horses, what time do you think that is approximately? And in relationship to what's going on with Reno, what's the relationship with Reno?
Well, Reno's been in the valley for about 30 minutes fighting. I think the Reno fight from beginning to end, and by the way, some of the eyewitnesses said this as well, probably was down in the valley for about 35 minutes before he reached the top of the bluffs when he skedaddles and tries to get out of the valley, taking heavy casualties. But and I think we know that Reno's going to be on the hilltop for 10 minutes before Benteen arrives on the scene.
So Benteen is perhaps 20 minutes away at this point when he's up there on the bluffs, as he's retreated up there. Something
Yeah.
like that. Okay. All right, so here, explain what happens here. So here is the assault of the three companies. What happens?
By the way, it's interesting that you have this map here because every map my early maps also showed an era here, and there's a big time era that's, again, more research is kind of produced. You see Reno's charge down there at the bottom of the map.
Yeah,
We know today that didn't happen.
that didn't happen.
No, he swung around the edge of the river. You see the river over there where Hodgson's killed, and you see all the little oxbows, and you see all
Right.
the river meanders. Reno actually rode right along the edge of the river there, and he arced over there to where his skirmish line is. And we know this from the verbal accounts by the soldiers and by John Ryan, who was at the right of the command, who was in charge of making sure Indians didn't come out of the brush near the river. So, and if you look at every Little Bighorn map, you're going to see this straight line across the valley. You even see it in the Court of Inquiry map, which we know had lots and lots of errors and problems, by the way. So, and by the way, recently in some of the archaeological stuff we found in the last 2 years, we found areas where John Ryan was fighting up in that timber along the edge of the river. So we've actually been able to match his company's uh, firing pin imprints in those casings along the edge of the river. So we can discount all of these maps that have Reno charging across the middle of the valley. And by the way, they charged, again, this is something that I've got in my book. It's a tactical thing that happens when they charged across the valley. They charged, we see it says M, A, and G lined up for the skirmish line. They actually charged GAM when they got down to that area where the skirmish line is. When they got off their horses and dismounted, they rotated that skirmish line. And that's a tactical thing that I discovered. And it's probably going to be in my book. It was the first time it was ever shown that way. How did I know that? Because there's a map made by a soldier who shows that disposition of soldiers. His name was William Morris, by the way. And in my book is a great map, one of the few maps made by an enlisted man, by the way. William Morris was down there on that skirmish line.
So
Uh,
actually, this map is inaccurate. It should be GAM on the left flank,
Charging,
right flank.
yeah, they charged JM, and then by the way, what they did when they dismounted, then they lined up correctly, like it shows their M, A, and G.
Ah, interesting. And on the left flank, where were the Iricaras? Were they on the left flank at that point?
Rickers, some of them were on the left flank, some of them were in the timber to the right, by the way.
Now, where were they holding the horse? Now, when they dismount, now see, the big argument is here you get into another argument.
Yeah.
So your take on this argument is that, and here, of course, is where they attack Reno ever afterwards, that he was a coward, that he should have pressed home the attack with three companies, I guess, 120 guys with scouts in support, that would have panicked the Indians and forced them to surrender. So, and you know, this is something that goes on into the 1879 Court of Inquiry with Reno. So,
Right.
what's your take on that whole argument?
Yeah. Well, you see there where it says clearing. And by the way, the most important thing that all these soldiers, including Custer's command, by the way, the most important thing you were concerned about was whatever you do, you don't want to lose your horses. You know, your horses are your way of getting out of there. Your horses have half of your ammunition in the saddlebags. You're going to protect your horses at all cost. And so immediately as they begin to dismount, and by the way, when Reno charges down there, he sends Sergeant Ryan with 10 men into that area. It says timber and clearing to make sure there's no warriors in there where their horses would be safe. And there's an old river bend there. And so, and there's an embankment right there too. And so they took all those horses down in there where they were safe. And they lined up on the skirmish line and began to fire into the oncoming wars. One of the things that Reno talks about at the Reno Court of Inquiry doesn't show up on the map. There was an old river creek that ran into the Gary Owen Loop there where it says Western Loop. And it was called Shoulder Blade Creek, and it was a ravine. It no longer exists. You can see it in some of the early topo maps of the area from the 1880s. And Reno talks about that the warriors began to fill this ravine and began to make a stand in this ravine, which be right in front of where you see the letters M, A, and G, by the way. So there's a ravine there. Reno in the Court of Inquiry, if you read it carefully, says if we'd gone another 60 yards, we would have been in that big ravine full of warriors. So it wasn't a flat area. And the warriors began to use that as a defensive position until they began to gather their horses. The big thing that happens with the warriors begin to react very quickly. They begin to get their horses off to the left. You see where it says crazy horse attack? They begin to come out of these bench lands. And if you look at the map made by William Morris, which I mentioned is in my book, you'll see that the skirmish line is bent. One company is firing towards the teepees, the other three are firing towards the benchlands, where most all the warriors are riding out, attacking the soldiers. And it won't take long before the warriors begin to flank that line. It's easy to get around the end of a line. Now, after they begin to fire, by the way, they marched about 100 yards, firing into the nearest warriors. Again, not taking any casualties for the most part. The Arickers are trying to stampede horses, but they're actually capturing horses and trying to get the heck out of there. And we know that Reno begins to panic a little bit. I mean, this is a guy that hadn't fought Indians before. And so far, he's done fairly well. He's farmed a skirmish line. A lot of the officers said if he had ridden into the village, nobody would be left to talk about it or tell the story. And I have a tendency to agree with that, obviously. You know, if you got 90 men riding through a village, you got 6 shooters, you're not going to be able to form a skirmish line in the middle of all those teepees. Anyway, it just wasn't going to happen, not with a mile and a half of Indian teepees. So I think Reno does the best he can at this point. He's concerned about his horses. He's hearing threats in the timber that his horses are being stolen or taken. And so he vacates after just about 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, he vacates the skirmish line and never reappears. He goes in the timber to see what's going on with the horses. And while he's down there, the warriors begin to infiltrate that timber where the horses are. And some people say Crazy Horse was actually one of those people that was down there. The skirmish line, Company G, begins to quickly retreat into the timber there, leaving two companies out there. Company A begins to run into the timber, leaving only one company out there, and that was French's company. And Captain Thomas French, who was a very brave officer, by the way. And he, in an orderly manner, begins to pull back the troops towards the timber over there. While Reno is in there, he's talking to one of his chief scouts, Bloody Knife and Arikara. What are the Indians going to do? And all of a sudden, Bloody Knife catches a bullet right between his eyes and it splatters brain matter all over Reno's face. Now, Reno's already concerned about being killed in this battle. He's been sipping from whiskey. And I think he suffers from a little battle shock. He's got brains in his mouth all of a sudden. And he tells his men to mount and then to dismount. And then there's more gunfire, and he tells them to mount back up. There's confusion. There's no bugle calls. And he says, anybody who wants to live, follow me. And that's when Reno tears out, starts out as an orderly retreat out of the timber. But as soon as they begin to leave the timber, the warriors converge into what they call a buffalo hunt. And that's where you see all of these different people killed, like Reynolds, who was a scout, McIntosh, who was not killed there, by the way, he was buried there. And you see Reynolds' retreat. You see Hodson was killed over by the river. McIntosh, by the way, was actually killed where the word ford is down there. His body was removed when Terry and Gibbon's troops came in. They camped down there and they moved all the dead bodies of the horses and the soldiers. And they moved McIntosh and buried him where you see McIntosh killed.
Now here is this is the Army's version of the sequence of events you've just discussed, retreating into there, and then, as I understand it, that was interesting. There was Spotted Tail Agency Indians were on the other side of the Little Bighorn River. I understand there was a warrior society there too. That had decided they didn't want to hang out with the only males were up there. So again, I'm just so there are people already on the other side of the river who are
Correct.
shooting, and some make a big deal about this position being where Reno should have taken his stand, where the retreat was into this looped area. What's your take on that? Some people say he should have defended there and stood his ground there. Is that what's your assessment of that argument?
Well, the problem is, as these things are happening in there with the threat to their horses, Reno's also beginning to run out of ammunition.
Ah,
He shot up about half of his ammunition, and they're having to go to their saddlebags to get the 50 rounds they have left. And Reno, of course, is looking and scanning across the valley there, looking for Custer, thinking to his mind, "Where's Custer? Where's Custer?" Here's a man who's being surrounded by 600 warriors. He's down in the timber, which is, by the way, a fairly good defensive place. Some people say he should have held the timber, but the problem is you can't hold the timber if you're out of ammunition. You'll be fighting with your knife. So anyway, the thing that Reno does incorrectly, and I think Reno again did the best he could under the circumstances. The problem that he did was he turned his back and he ran. They probably should have formed a skirmish line and fought their way to the river and then crossed. Most people say that Reno was trying to cross the original ford, but the huge number of warriors forced him to that riverbank where it says ford. And by the way, it wasn't a ford, it was a buffalo trail. The bank was at least 4 feet high on both sides. It was almost impossible to get into the river and out of the river. But the Indians, the huge numbers of warriors, forced them to jump their horses into the river and then to attempt to get out on the other side. And this is where a lot of the warriors said we just sat there pumping lead into these soldiers trying to escape across the river. And they had a hard time getting across there. They would eventually scatter, as you see in the map, and get up to the top of the hill where they begin to eventually will run into Reno. Reno will come up, not Reno, excuse me, Benteen will arrive about 10 minutes after they get on the hill. But the warriors all describe it as a buffalo hunt, that the soldiers, they rode up among the soldiers, shot them at close range and knocked them off their horses. And there'll be about 30 casualties. And there'll be quite a few warrior casualties as well down there, by the way, in this close, almost hand-to-hand fighting.
Now, here you have the sequence of events. Again, your interpretation is this is all happening about an hour earlier.
Yeah, at least.
Army's maps here. Now, here we have on the left-hand side the movements of Custer's battalion. So this is, of course, before Benteen. Benteen will eventually come in and reinforce Reno with the pack train. But this is essentially around 1500 hours these events are occurring here, according to your timeline. So what's going on here with Custer's column at 1500 hours as these guys are retreating at the same time?
Well, we've got to kind of go back in space. Remember, we've got Custer. We left Custer watering his horses down at that area known as the flats down there. And we know that Custer takes that big ravine up there. He has his Crow Scouts, four of them go up towards the top of the ridge to see what the village looks like, to see if there is a village. Again, Custer has not seen the village yet. And so he gets up on top of these bluffs. And there's a big hill up there called Sharpshooter's Ridge. And it's about 600 yards north of where Reno and Benteen will later hold up. And Custer goes up with John Martin, who's his orderly of the day. They go up to the top of that hill. And this is the first time Custer actually sees the village for the most part. And he can see it spread out, but he can't see the whole village because there's a big hill down there called Weir Point that blocks his view of the other end of the village. He can see that it's huge, but he can't see the whole village because again of the terrain, the roughness of the terrain. He looks down, and by the way, you showed that little Indian camp on the east side of the river there. I think that's probably what Custer's looking at
Huh.
through his binoculars that he borrowed from DeRudio, which were pretty high powered. They could see women and children and dogs milling around and playing around, and they couldn't see hardly any warriors in sight. Remember, most of the warriors are sleeping in at this time. And this is what Custer believes, and the officers begin to talk about. They must be away hunting buffalo because we'd seen buffalo hunt skinned all along the trail. And so Custer thinks that he snuck up on them, that maybe a lot of the warriors are vacant. He knows that not all the warriors are vacant, obviously. This is where all the men get excited and begin to cheer. And Custer tells them to hold their horses. There's enough for them all down there. He says, we'll finish this up and we'll go home to our station. And they begin to ride down towards the river to try to find an access to get across. And by the way, there's high bluffs all along the river there. It's hard to see the terrain in this map, but it's impossible pretty much to get down any of that terrain without going downstream.
So,
Now,
so here around this map is saying that Boston Custer re-arrives at the main column of two battalions approximately 14, 40 hours, let's say, And so you're saying that, again, the terrain here is very difficult to just go straight down to the river on
Yeah,
horseback?
you couldn't go off those bluffs. They're 100 foot tall. Very, very difficult. And it wouldn't be a very accessible place anywhere down there for the most part.
So then,
Uh,
so then you get to Medicine Tail Coulee. Explain
yeah.
the terrain
And
down
by the
there.
way, there's some major mistakes in this, and a lot of people say there's a lot of conjecture. There's not a lot of conjecture about a lot of this stuff. You just have to do some real long, serious research on this. And this map is in error in several places. Not only do I believe that the times are way off, but you'll notice down there it says Boyer and Curley.
Right.
Curley was a Crow Indian scout. He was the youngest of all the scouts. He had had a major fight with the other three or the other five scouts the day before. And according to White Man Runs Him, who was one of the scouts who went up there with Custer, he said that Curley left them down there somewhere on Reno Creek. Okay, that's what he says. We also know that the Arikars who captured some horses right after Custer vacates that Sharpshooter Ridge area, they ride up where Reno would ride up later on, and Curley will bump into an Arikara scout by the name of Black Fox, and he and Black Fox will take some of these Sioux ponies, and they will head back down Reno Creek. So this is a myth in this map right here that Curley is riding with Boyer or with Custer. And by the way, not only do the Crows say that, but the Arikaras say that. Okay. So you have two people who are telling Curley, you're lying through your teeth, as did many of the warriors, by the way. Not only that, there's a guy named John Berkman who's riding with the pack mules who
Oh,
sees
explain who he is. Yeah.
John Berkman sees Curley with the horses and Black Fox the Arika ride past him miles and miles away. So this story of Curley watching the battle, watching this, watching that is myth. Most of it's all myth. And as a matter of fact, a year after the battle, Sheridan had Curley with him on the battlefield. He asked him questions. Curley couldn't answer any of the questions about the tactics of the soldiers. And it was Sheridan, Michael Sheridan, Phil Sheridan's brother, who said, I don't believe Curley saw any part of this battle. So you've got eyewitnesses who said he wasn't there. You've got eyewitnesses that saw he's miles away from there. So you got to be real careful. And here's where you have another major dilemma with Curley, the Crow Indian scout. Curley is the only person who says that the troops went down what's called Cedar Coulee, which you see on your map right there. And you have this is very old translation, very old research, very old material, and it's not soundly researched, by the way.
Interesting. Interesting.
So you have one person, and by the way, he told Walter Camp that Walter Camp mapped it. It became an accepted route. Which, by the way, Cedar Coulee takes you a mile away from Medicine Tail Coulee, a mile away.
So
A
here
mile
you
away
have
from the
here
village.
here here you have an extension of the Army map. So this is the next phase here now. So critique this.
Yep. So what you have is you see the red line down there, right next to the bluffs. And I don't know what the red line Indian art Indian attacks. Okay. And by the way, this is really I like this. This is kind of interesting. Uh, Boyer did tell the other three Crow Indian scouts, "You can leave now," and he does. And by the way, John Martin, when John Martin leaves he said he left at a ravine. It was 600 yards. That's the ravine that led down to where they went into Medicine Tail Coulee. And what actually happens with Custer's five companies is they ride right down along the edge of the bluffs, all the way down 600 yards from Medicine Tail Coulee, about where you see that red arrow at the bottom there, where it says Medicine Tail. That's where Custer enters, not way back there, about a mile away. Now, you say, how do we know that? There's several reasons. McGuire mapped it. He shows he followed the trail. Benteen mapped it in his map. Showed him going over Weir Point, going right along the bluffs. Martin also says we were on the high ground. For the first time, we could see the entire Indian village.
At which point on this? Oh, excuse me. Where? Up here on Loose
But you don't
Ridge?
see where it says Weir Point right there?
Yeah.
They come right over Weir Point down there towards that red area down there. So this is the first time Custer sees the entire village
Ah,
when they go to that high Weir Point.
interesting.
If you went down Cedar Coulee, you would not be able to see the entire Indian village. So you have, by the way, several of these Indian. By the way, there's also another map made by the Three Crow Indians, made with E.S. Curtis. It shows the trail going right where you see the red line down there where it says Indian attacks. So we've got lots of major problems with this map right here.
So the weird, so the it's so interesting. Edward Curtis, of course, is a famous photographer,
Geography, yeah.
and Mitch Boyer is a famous scout who's killed at this battle. So the first time they actually see the whole encampment is when they get up on top of Weir Point.
Your point, actually, they go right over that area into a big ravine. By the way, it's called the Western Coulee today. If you look on a USGS map, you'll see this large coulee, which is, by the way, where the current Park Service road goes. Okay, it's interesting that the Park Service road goes up the route where Custer uh, probably came down because it empties into Medicine Tail Coulee. This huge western coulee empties into the ravine 600 yards. And by the way, if you get a measuring device, the ravine opening is 600 yards. And by the way, Martin said I didn't go into Medicine Tail Coulee. I got the message from Cook right there when they were turning to go down into Medicine Tail. He said when I left, I saw Boyer in the front, and the soldiers were beginning to move out, and I saw Custer 200 yards away from the command.
All
That
right,
was the last sighting by John Martin before he left with the message.
interesting. And what time do you think that is in relationship to Reno and Benteen having all their Michigas over there on that hill
This is going to make some people's butt pucker. Reno is fighting in the valley
in the valley?
as
Wow.
he's fighting in the valley as Martin comes up to the top of Weir Point. He looks down and he can see Reno's men falling back into the timber from their skirmish line.
So,
So
okay, so
Custer,
actually,
Custer has engaged. And by the way, when Martin leaves with the message, he turns around and he sees the soldiers excitedly falling back from the river, and he also hears the gunfire behind him. So this is something you will not probably read in many books, but Custer is engaged at the same time Reno is engaged.
so by the time Reno is up there on that hilltop at 1500 hours, let's say, you're saying at the same time he's beginning to be engaged,
Custer's already engaged.
Custer's engaged. How's that engagement unfold from in your mind?
Well, there, again, we got to rely. This is where you got to rely on Indian accounts. We know that all five companies, there's no division like you see in the map here. There's no division. Martin sees all five companies down in that area next to the river, just a few hundred yards away from the river. We know according to the Indian accounts, and by the way, most all the Indian accounts are Cheyenne accounts. Okay. You will not see this in any of the Indian maps, military maps. As far as I know, you will not find it in any other maps, but it's in my book. When they got down to the river's edge, they couldn't get across.
So they're coming down in column of twos, or is this a whole column?
They're probably coming down in columns of twos, probably right, down Medicine Tail towards the edge of the river. When they get down to the river where it says Ford, I think
Ford B. Ford B.
By the way, it's always called Ford B. That was McGuire's mapping. The Indians nor the soldiers crossed at Ford B. How do we know that? You got to read the Reno Court of Inquiry. Witness after witness talks about on the western side of the river there, it was quicksand and it was miry and boggy.
Hmm.
Scout Gerard rode over there and said no Indian ponies or animals had ridden across on the other side. However, the other side where Custer's coming down is cut up by hundreds and hundreds of pony tracks because they were using it previously as a watering spot. Now, right down from Ford A, about 200 yards, is another ford which is used today for the reenactments and everything else. This is where most of the warriors talked about coming across the river. No warriors, even though it was the shortest route from Reno's fight to get to Custer, none of the Indians crossed at Ford B. None of them. Now, not only do you read and by the way, even Benteen said it was quagmire. It was miry. He said uh, there were several other Indians who talked about the fact that it was uncrossable there. Hornhorse said 2 soldiers were killed in the river and swallowed up by the quicksand. I have 3 or 4 other Indian accounts, by the way, that are in my book that talk about that Custer was not able to cross the river there because of the condition of the bank.
Interesting.
That was the Western Bank. Now you won't see this. You won't see this again. This is some dedicated research and looking at every possible uh, answer to why Custer didn't cross down there. And
So,
that's one of them. That's only one. That's only one reason, by the way.
so at 1500 hours, in terms of what we're seeing here in the interpretation of the Indian deployments, what is your estimate of how the Indians are moving warriors to confront this threat at
Well,
1500 hours?
the Indians again. I don't use the word 1500. That's 3 o'clock, right?
Well, this you're saying we're assuming that the time here of 1600 hours is inaccurate. It's an hour. I'm going under your timeline.
You
It's
remember I said that Reno's fighting at probably maybe 12:30 to 1.
12:30 to 1, and he's forced to retreat up to here.
Yeah. By the
So
way, military time, if I'm not mistaken, 12:30 would be 12:30.
correct.
1 o'clock would be probably
1300.
1300. Okay. So I think, yeah, 1300 is when the battle at Reno's fighting, Custer's fighting at the same time, about
Really?
1300. Yep. Almost exactly the same time.
So this that's labeled here at 1600 hours. This should be around 1300 hours.
Yep. Absolutely.
Oh,
These guys
interesting.
are way off.
Fascinating. 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 Okay.
Well,
So
again, they haven't done they haven't done cross checking. I've done timed rides on all this stuff. And it actually takes 9 minutes to get from that place where you got the message to get to Weir Point. And by
okay.
the way, it takes another 2 or 3 minutes to get up there. Reno was supposedly on the skirmish line 15 minutes. It acts exactly right. Mark was up there probably at about 13 minutes after he got the message, just in time to see see Reno's men falling back from the river.
So the timing on this atlas done by Fort Leavenworth is totally inaccurate then from your
Totally
perspective.
inaccurate,
Okay.
as is
Uh,
much of the other information.
Now here is the Benteen swinging left. We've already gone through this pretty carefully. Uh, this is another. Well, we can go back. This is Peter Thompson. Uh, I will get to this in a moment. The siege. Now, okay. So what happens here? So at 1300 hours. These are different maps of the actual last stand, if you will.
Sure.
Um, and here is an interpretation. I guess this you would find inaccurate too. This is from Andrist.
Yeah.
He's referring to the movement of troops in a totally different way than you are.
Yep.
Talking about how they don't come down that particular they don't come down Medicine Tail Coulee with let's see, you're arguing they're coming down in columns of four.
Yeah. Let's look at that map for a second.
Which
Let's,
one?
let's, let's talk what happens. Not only is the crossing a bad crossing, but the Cheyennes are going to greet these soldiers as they get to the edge of the river. They said 2 companies tried to cross. One of them was riding white horses, the other was riding bay horses. Now, it's interesting, there were 3 companies riding bay horses down there. And this is where David Humphreys Miller's book comes in real handy. He interviewed a lot of these Cheyennes back in the 1930s. The unfortunate thing, he was kind of an exaggerator and liked to make up stuff. But he has a guy named Joseph White Cowbull, a Cheyenne, who had a repeating weapon, who's on the edge of the river down there. He sees a man in a buckskin suit riding up to the edge of the river into the water, shoots him, and he falls from his horse. And men rescue him and take him back from the river there. He also sees a guy carrying a guidon, a flag, which shows you where the company commander is. And he is also shot and killed by Joseph White Cowbull. There's other Cheyennes and some Sioux in the area shooting across the river. So you have several soldiers. By the way, there's several Indian accounts that said that one soldier, a non-commissioned officer, a man with stripes on his shoulders, rode across the river and was killed into the village. Many people think that's probably Lieutenant Porter, who was Company I. His jacket was found next to his horse in the village, by the way. Who was the guy in the buckskin suit that was shot? Who do you think that to sell a lot of books? Who do you
Yeah,
want to die at the river?
Custer, of course.
You want Custer to die. And by the way, it wasn't Custer that was shot at the river. There's too many other little bits of evidence that he survives to the last stand hill, by the way. This is something that's new. It's in my book for the first time. The one it's where the rivers ran red. A year after, Company I comes back to the battlefield to clean up the battlefield and bury the dead again. As they go down towards Ford B, so-called Ford B, by the way, they're going to find a shoe belonging to Captain Miles Keogh.
Mm,
He was wearing shoes. Not only did they find one of his shoes down by the edge of the river, they found one of his bloody canvas leggings,
mm.
or his shoe. By the way, guess who was wearing buckskin down there? Miles Keogh. Okay. So they find his shoe and they find his bloody legging. By the way, when they find Keogh up on the battle ridge, he's not found in a command position. He's found near the horses down there, which I think probably was a hospital area. And he's not found where he should be as a commanding officer of that whole battalion on the ridge. He's found down on a slope, down in a low area. So you say, was that possibly Keogh? I think it's very, very good circumstantial evidence. Joseph White Cowboy was telling the truth. Did shoot a man in buckskin. By the way, Custer had his buckskin coat off at the time of the fight, according to the Indian scouts who saw him leave that way. But this is something that's never been published that I'm working on right now. They just recently, I found some unpublished material that the guy who was killed and found a year later, found a body down at Ford B, was Corporal John Wild, who was carrying Keogh's flag. He
Mm.
was found down there and reburied. They moved him up to the top of the hill up there and buried him with Keogh. And you'll see his name on a plank up there. It's interesting in some of these early photographs. So we know that Company I leadership was pretty much shot up, maybe destroyed there at the edge of the river at a crossing that was impossible to cross. You have Company E also perhaps losing a commander down there, James Sturgis. The 7th Cavalry's Samuel Sturgis, his son, was Company E down there. By the way, he was an engineering officer on the Reno Scout. The Indians said a man was killed down there along the edge of the river, and they found a compass and a map case on his body down there. So you've got all these officers being shot down there and killed or wounded, and other men being wounded down in this area down there. The soldiers dismount. All 5 companies dismount and begin to fire across the river.
All 5 at this point
All
dismount
5 are down there firing. Yeah, all 5, or they've all
at
dismounted.
Ford B, around Ford B.
Ford B. And the Indian pressure begins to ramp up quickly. People are beginning to come that have horses are beginning to back up these guys at the edge of the river, and they're going to get across the river, as I mentioned, about 200 yards further down, and begin to flank some of these soldiers. There's more likely, like I said, Company I is in trouble down there. Matter of fact, the Indians talk about this Bay Horse Company beginning to run, and that the other soldiers fired at them. They
Mm.
weren't firing at them, they were doing cover fire. And we know where they were shooting from. We found artifacts down there. So you have 2 companies, by the way. We think, according to Reno, and I believe too, archaeologically, I have some evidence too. Company C and I Keogh is in trouble. Company C, they're going to begin to retreat and diagonal up to what's called Calhoun Hill. The Indians talk about 2 companies vacated the area very quickly and began to ride to the north. However, there's going to be 3 companies still down there. What happens to them? Red Hawk, one of the Indian scouts, not Indian scouts, one of the Indians fighting Custer, shows a map that shows exactly what happened. They begin to fall back up to the high ground directly behind them, known as Cartwright Ridge. And they're going to find over 400, maybe 500 casings up on top of that hill in the 1950s. Almost nobody knew about this fight up there. And anyway, if you look at McGuire's map, McGuire shows the trails. He sees the two trails, one angling off towards Calhoun Hill, the other angling off up towards Nye Cartwright Ridge. The three companies are going to get up to the top of the ridge. They're going to fight up there for 20 to 30 minutes, according to Wolftooth, was one of the wars fighting them up there. They shoot volleys of gunfire. By this time, Reno and Benteen have gotten to the top of the hill. The soldier said after we were there a few minutes on top of the hill, we began to hear tremendous volleys of gunfire. So we begin to get some timing going on. The fight over there on Nye Cartwright Ridge is taking place about when Reno and Benteen get to the top of the hill.
Go on.
And by the way, a guy named Edward Luce, superintendent, did sound test out there. He got guys on Reno Benteen fire. He got people on Nye Cartwright to fire weapons up on top of Nye Cartwright. Then he had them move over to Calhoun Hill. Then he had them to move over to Custer Hill. He could only hear the firing from Reno Hill from Nye Cartwright Ridge.
Ah, wow, wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Wow, it is amazing.
This is the 1950s.
So Nye Cartwright Ridge, in terms of, here's this army, this map from Fort Leavenworth, it shows absolutely no fighting going on over there on the map.
Exactly.
And you're saying, so then what happens? So for example, you have this argument that Custer was probing with Yates's battalion to cross further north from Ford B and go to where we have on this map, the North Ford. How is your assessment of that?
By the way, the Indians talk about this. The guys on Nye Cartwright Ridge combined with the guys that were already on Calhoun Hill. Okay. They combined and united for a very brief time.
They fall back. Got it.
Fall back. All of them fall back. And people, by the way, and I don't like to use a lot of conjecture. Some people say that well, there's more to the story. It gets more and more complicated on what actually Reno and Benteen actually see out there. And there's some contention from some soldiers that they actually saw. We know that the warriors from Sharpshooter Ridge that were firing at Reno and Benteen's men could see the guys on Nye Cartwright turn around and chase them. We also know of one soldier named Jacob Hetler who got up on the same ridge, looked down, and saw the men on Nye Cartwright Ridge as well. So, and by the way, those guys are firing over at Reno Benteen because they're driving the Indians off that hill. So there's a good chance Jacob Hetler saw signal men over there, people that were signaling. So Custer may believe from Nye Cartwright Ridge that Benteen is right on his heels, should be there any minute. He begins to go northward. Of course, we know what's going to happen. Reno and Benteen are not going to go anywhere. They're going to listen to the gunfire, and later on they will say that they didn't hear the gunfire. So once we have these five companies reunited on top of Calhoun Hill, it's my supposition, number one, you got people that have been dehorsed. We know that a fact from the Indians. They talk about men losing their horses. You got men with no horses, and by this time you have wounded soldiers. What are you supposed to do with them? They put them in what's called Horseholders Ravine over there. And I think that's likely a spot where Captain Miles Keel probably ended up as well. Custer not allowing, he sees these huge numbers of women and children beginning to flee down towards the north. And the Indians talk about this in many of their accounts. It looked like the soldiers were chasing the women and children. And E&F companies will go all the way down, like you show in your map here, past Custer Hill, down to a northern ford. There's two fords down there. One of them is called Ford D. The other's called the Willie Benz Ford. And we know from some recent archaeology and also Indian accounts by John Stangentimber and Wolftooth, soldiers got all the way down that area before they began to retreat back up towards Last Stand Hill.
I see.
He's making a probe down there. He's still on the offense until the very end.
And so the timing here, again, the armies, because we're not even talking about what's going on. We'll get to that in a moment. This is saying between 1650 and 1720 hours. You're saying this is occurring about 3 hours earlier than this, right? About 1350 hours between So basically around 2 o'clock to 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is
I
all.
think the battle begins about 1 o'clock and it's over with a little after 3 o'clock. Most all the accounts by the soldiers and by even the Indians uh, talked about it. You know, the Indians that could tell time, by the way, and there were some. There was one called Jan Timber who went out there with Wolf Tooth with a watch and he timed stuff. It was probably over within about 2 hours. The whole battle was. It ended.
Now, what do you characterize the Indian tactics at this particular, and at this point, what in terms of the archaeological evidence, what does it show specifically about this fight, and also the tactics we see from the oral histories of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors that we now interpret into the mix of this?
Most of the Indians came up deep coulee. Remember the ford that I mentioned? It was a little bit north of Ford B.
Right.
That was a major thoroughfare. And the warriors began to come up there. And there's a big ridge that's not shown on this map. It's called Greasy Grass Ridge. And they found huge number of Indian casings on that ridge, by the way. Lots and lots. The warriors began to get between their families and the soldiers who were up on the ridge. A lot of the warriors didn't know that E&F Company and Custer's headquarters had gone down to the north. They didn't know that. A lot of them didn't. They don't talk about it until later on. But they see these soldiers fighting on top of Calhoun Hill and they begin to infiltrate. By the way, other warriors will go down to Deep Ravine. There's a ford there. They begin to come up there. Crazy Horse will probably come up uh, Deep Ravine's ford there. And it's not, well, you see Deep Ravine there, right there in the middle of this map. That's perhaps where Crazy Horse came up according to his own accounts. But you see Calhoun Hill at the upper right hand. You see Horse Rollers Ravine, and you have three companies up there: C Company, L Company, and I Company being held evidently in reserve near the horses back there. Again, I think they've lost most of their leadership at this point. Probably protecting the horses, probably trying to protect the wounded as well up there. Um, Calhoun, James Calhoun, is Custer's brother-in-law. He'll hold a skirmish line up there. They will find later on huge numbers of casings by the men who died in a line up there. They held their line. However, the warriors, there's Greasy Grass Ridge. You can see it down there, and you see the warriors beginning to penetrate with that little dotted arrow, which is correct, by the way. You have Company C who rides from Calhoun Hill down and drives those warriors back and pushes them back. And then all of a sudden, Lame White Man and Yellow Nose and several other warriors say, "There's not many soldiers down here. We can kill them all." And they will lead a counterattack against Company C. And at number 4 right there is a place called Finkel Finley Ridge, which is where Company C commanders were found right there. By the way, Company C rode sorrel horses, and the sorrel horses are going to be found all over the battlefield, as well as Company C, because they're going to be wiped out in this countercharge by the Indian warriors, led by Lame White Man, who, by the way, is killed on the Battle Ridge or right below the Battle Ridge and scalped by the Lakota. He's a Cheyenne, Southern Cheyenne, but he's scalped by the Lakota, who think he might be one of the Indian scouts for Custer. As the Indians begin to roll, it's like a tidal wave. As they begin to come up towards the top of that ridge, they will wipe out Calhoun Hill. Again, they found sometimes 20 or 30 cartridges by men lying in a line up there on the edge of that ridge. Right outside that little area that says, I think it's number 8 on the map, is a place called Henryville. And the archaeology shows huge numbers of warriors very close to the Calhoun Hill that were using repeating weapons. And the soldiers just couldn't fire fast enough. They will overrun Calhoun Hill and they will sweep through and stampede all the horses in Horseholders Ravine. Then they will stumble upon Company I, what's left of them up there. And if you go up there today, you can see the white markers. There's a large number of markers near what says Horseholders Ravine, where Company I and other men from other companies are found trying to flee into that area to escape the onslaught of warriors who are wiping out everybody on Calhoun Hill. By this time, Custer's left wing has come back up to, or I don't want to use the word left wing, I want to use companies E&F at headquarters, have come back up to Last Stand Hill. And if you look at the markers today, you can visualize the soldiers trying to escape the huge numbers of warriors that are enveloping Calhoun Hill, and they're trying to escape and get to Custer Hill. where they're starting to put up a defense there. By the way, where it sees Horseholders Ravine is where Crazy Horse will ride up over the ridge and ride right through the soldiers as they're fleeing. So there was a gap in the line there, and he rode through, and 40 soldiers shot at him, and every bullet missed him. It only encouraged the warriors to fight more ferociously. And again, they're going to basically wipe out that end of the battle ridge out there of any soldiers, leaving only E and F and the headquarters group near the last stand to be fighting.
And so, approximately, what time do you feel the entire force is destroyed?
Again, probably by if you started at 1 o'clock, I'm thinking everything is over with about 2 to 2:30.
2 to 2:30. All right, and then let's get back to this. So here you have the whole question of what's happening with the Weir Point, and then at what point do you feel that you have Benteen come up, you have the pack train behind him. What time is that approximately in your mind when they come up?
Well, it takes the pack mules about 30 minutes to get up there after Reno and Benteen have combined their forces up there. And by the way, the pack mules with the ammunition arrived first. They were told to get the ammo pack mules up first because they needed the ammunition. Uh, we know that Benteen's men would share their ammunition with the depleted troops of what was left of Reno's command. And but this is where it gets very controversial because we know at some point they begin to hear all this gunfire, and Weir is concerned about the fact that they're not moving towards the sound of the gunfire.
What time do you think, do you estimate they're hearing that? This is the volley gunfire when
Yeah.
the companies have retreated, and from your interpretation, deny
I
Cartwright
caught-
Ridge.
Yeah.
That's what they're hearing. Because
They're
that,
hearing the firing on Nye Cartwright. And of course, after they moved to Calhoun, they talked about it begins to diminish. By the way, another thing that happens is there's soldiers that are left behind in the timber down in the valley. Reno left them down there. And they said after Reno,
just hold on a second, Michael. So here we see, so you can see here on this map, here's like Cartwright Ridge, and further south on the map, you see Weir Point. So here's where they're shooting the battalion. Actually, so it's fascinating because this is where the battalion of the companies that Custer is directly commanding, I guess, are operating from, according to your
right.
interpretation. And then they're firing, and that's where they're hearing them further south at Weir Point. And again, just to repeat, what time of the day is that, do you think?
Again, we know that probably that Reno will get up on top of the hill about, well, Reno and Benteen will combine after 35 minutes, but probably 140, 150, something around there before 2 o'clock.
All right. So
I
here,
think,
okay,
I
so
think, I
yeah.
think the fighting down at the ford took about 20 minutes, and then they're going to be up on top of Night Cartwright, fighting up there for 20 to 30 minutes, according to John Stanzentember. That's how long they fought up there. So again, we're using Indian time here. We're using some Indians who talked about the fighting being that extended time up there on Night Cartwright for a while.
So when Weir arrives, now Weir, in terms of the internal politics of the regiment, he's sort of in the Custer camp.
He's in the Custer camp. He's one of the Custer clan, more or less.
And
He's
he gets angry that they're not doing a goddamn thing. So here you get into the issue of, okay, so were Reno and Benteen cowards, and did they basically refuse to go ahead to rescue him because of their animosity, or what? And could they actually have done anything at this point in time, in your opinion?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things that we know, um, we're Weir's up there with Reno and Benteen. However, something that gets left out of the story quite often, it gets left out of the timelines. I just read a new book that again is off on the timeline, and it leaves out a very important fact. When Reno gets up to the top of the hill, he's very concerned about his really good buddy Benny Hodgson. Now, Benny Hodgson was killed as he tried to cross the river down there. He's shot and wounded, grabs hold of another soldier's stirrup, is pulled across the river, and then the Indians kill him as he gets to the other side of the river there. And he's got a marker down there to this day where Hodgson was killed. Reno evidently had really liked Benny Hodgson for what they were good buddies, evidently. the first thing, one of the first things that here he's lost 30 men. He's gotten kicked as he's coming up towards the top of the hill. And one of the things that he says to Benteen is, he was an adjutant, by the way. I've lost one of my men down there, Benny Hodson. That's his main concern. It's not what's happening on top of the hill. It's not what has happened to him. It's my buddy got killed down at the edge of the river. So what does Reno do? He leaves the command. He leaves the command, walks down to the edge of the river, and tries to get his keys and his personal belongings off of his body.
Himself, he goes himself.
He goes himself,
Wow.
walks down there, and by the way, it's a hell of a climb down there and a hell of a climb back. And it took him 30 minutes to do that. Okay. So this gunfire is happening as he begins to go down to the river to find Benny Hodson's personal belongings. And when he comes back is when Weir will accost him and say, "Hey, we need to do something. We're hearing all this gunfire." And Weir looks at Edgerly, who's is one of his officers, and said, "Will you go down there with me if I get permission?" And Edgerly kind of shakes his head, and Weir goes over there, and evidently there's an animated discussion. Soldiers talking about Weir's waving his hands, not getting any permission, evidently from Reno. And then all of a sudden, Weir gets on his horse by himself and begins to ride towards the sound of the gunfire. Which by this time, by the way, things are already happening on the Custer end of the fight. The fighting at Knife Cartwright is over with. There's fighting along the ridge. And when Weir takes off by himself, Edgerly thinks he's gotten permission. Talk about non-communication. Weir takes off, and Edgerly thinks he's gotten permission and mounts up the entire company, Company D, and they begin to ride down with Weir towards this very high hill, which is today called Weir Point. It kind of blocks the view of down to the battlefield. Weir will go up on top of the hill, and Edgerly will swing way out with his company and go all the way down to the edge, evidently, of Medicine Tail Coulee.
Wow.
By the time they get out there and look down, they see Indians riding around the battlefield with guidons or flags, company flags riding around. And they also can see Indians shooting into objects on the ground. They couldn't tell exactly what those objects were, evidently. Okay.
So according to this, that map doesn't show this. So you're saying that actually D Company gets all the way down into
Yeah,
that
they go back.
Medicine Tail Coulee area. Okay.
How do we know that? Because Edgerly drew a map. It's in my book, by the way. Yeah, the Army haven't obviously looked at that map, but Edgerly makes a big swing, comes up there, and Weir is up there by himself. And by the way, when Edgerly gets up to the top of the hill, Weir has disappeared. Weir's gone. And what Weir has done, he's gone back to tell Reno what he's seeing out there, what's going on. About that time, Benteen, who, by the way, chastised Weir for leaving, he said he left without being an insubordinate. He was insubordinate, and then when he left, Benteen, along with two other companies, Godfrey's company and French's company, three
What
companies.
companies? That's M and what?
It's M and let me see, and K.
K. They come in. They start moving to join
They
D
they
Company.
move up and they join Weir up at the top of the hill up there, and they look around. Benteen says, "This is a hell of a place to fight Indians." He looks over there and he says, "I put my guide on up, hoping Custer would see it and come to us." And anyway, that was that was the encouragement that Benteen gave to Custer. Come to my flag if you can see it. They will all begin to pull back. Benteen will pull back.
Benteen comes up with Company G and H.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah,
So what time in the afternoon is that, would you say?
or with M. I think it's M Company because French has
M
M.
Company. M Company. K, so this map shows H, K, M, and G, and D. D
Yeah,
makes a movement that we don't see on this map or the Army, the U.S. Army map that actually goes to Medicine Tail Coulee, then they pull back. And
right.
then this whole battalion is up there. What time is that approximately? When do they start seeing the Indians start coming at them?
I think what they began to, and by the way, this is what's really interesting, and again, this is talked about in the book. Um, when they get up there, they begin to look down that direction, and they can see Indians in huge numbers. They said the whole side of a hill began to be dark. And what they're seeing, of course, is the warriors coming up towards the Last Stand Hill. They said it was on the side of a hill, and the timing is such that probably that's what they were witnessing. They were seeing the very end of the battle on the Last Stand Hill in that neck of the woods. I mean, this is what Weirs and Edgerly are seeing out there.
Did anybody look at a watch?
No, I don't remember them talking about
Okay, got it. Got it.
they're too busy worried about all these warriors about to come towards them. But they did see something that's real fascinating. And I bring this up as a timing issue. Right at the end of the battle from Custer's Last Stand Hill, a man on a sorrel horse takes off of that ridge, and the Indians, lots and lots of Indian warriors talk about this man on this really fast sorrel horse. And remember, the sorrels were ridden by Company C. This particular gentleman rides as fast as he can along the battle ridge. There's warriors all along the ridge. He cuts right through the middle of these warriors that are coming towards the Last Stand Hill, or in most cases, that are kind of laying down in the grass, working their way that direction. This guy rides off the top of Calhoun Hill, rides down into the ravine, keeps on riding, goes up on top of a ridge, and is killed there by his own hand or by the warriors. We don't know for sure because there's different stories from different warriors. Some say he accidentally shot himself with his revolver in the head. Some of them said he committed suicide. Crazy Horse said, I shot him and killed him. Okay. Anyway, who was this guy? And was he seen by Weir on top of the hill? The answer is yes. There was a guy next to Weir. His name was Flanagan, and he had binoculars. Flanagan said later on, and by the way, this is in the camp notes at I think it's at Indiana University. We saw a guy coming, riding as fast as he could, and he came on top of a rise and he was killed. And he was seen by Flanagan. And by the way, he gave his binoculars to Weir, where he could look over that direction. Flanagan is the only man who talks about seeing this lone soldier riding towards them, towards Weir Point. And you might ask, who was this guy? His name was Corporal John Foley. Now, Corporal John Foley was the first man they found when they began to bury men on the 28th of June. As on the 28th, Reno's men lined up, they formed a skirmish line, went across the entire battlefield. The guy they found on that ridge, and by the way, there's a marker for him today there with his name on it. This is a fairly recent addition, by the way, because of new research. Corporal John Foley was found there. One of the guys recognized him, said, here's Corporal Foley of Company C. And they went over to his body to get ready to bury it, and they unbuttoned his jacket. And inside his jacket was a bloody guidon. He was the flag carrier for Company C. And he had taken the flag off, stuffed it in his jacket, and they recovered that flag and took it off his body there and buried him there on the battlefield on that rise where Flanagan saw him coming towards. So we can kind of time the battle. We know that Corporal Foley leaves right at the end, right before the Last Stand Hill falls. And so here we know that Weir's on top of the hill. He's watching Custer Hill fall. He's watching Corporal John Foley ride towards him, probably as a messenger for Custer. Perhaps Custer even sees Weir's men on top of the hill. We don't know that. That's all conjecture right there. But the timing, if you could see through all the dust and smoke, which obviously the Indians did at some point because they all began to head towards Weir's men on top of that hill. But that's a lot of great information. By the way, what happened to that flag? You may want to guess. It just sold for several $1,000,000 to a private company.
Wow.
It was in a museum. I think it was in Detroit for a long time, and then they needed some money, so they sold it, and then I think it was resold recently here for millions of dollars. But the flag from John Foley was found on his body.
Interesting. Now here we see the retreat of this force back to the hilltop. Well, explain what happens there.
Well, as we talked about a while ago, when Edgerly gets up on top of the hill, he notices, and by the way, Weir's gone. Weir's falling back as well. Remember, he rode that by himself. And Edgerly sees these war. Edgerly doesn't want to fall back. He wants to stay out there and fight. But he's told by the officers. They send a message to him that he needs to come on back. By the way, I didn't mention this earlier. As all these other companies begin to go out there to look for Custer, Reno begins to mount up the pack mules and the wounded, and they will get several hundred yards before all those other companies begin to come back. So Reno doesn't get very far at all off the hill where it says hospital there. And we know that these other companies, besides Company D, Weir's company, are all going to fall back. They're going to fall back and begin to take a defensive position on what's kind of like a horseshoe, a saucer shape. Hospital's the low area where they put all their mules and horses, and the soldiers begin to line up in little company lines up on top of those ridges to protect themselves. As Edgerly begins to fall back, there's a guy named Vincent Charlie, and you see a little box there that says the death of Vincent Charlie. And Vincent Charlie was from Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. And he was shot through the hips and fell off his horse. And Edgerly rides up there and says, "Go hide in this ravine, and I'll go get some more men, and we'll come back and get you." And Vincent Charlie evidently does the best he can. He crawls over into a small little ravine there on the back side of Weir Point as the Indians begin to pour over the top of that hill. Edgerly falls back. According to Edgerly's account, which may differ from some of the other accounts, he was told that he couldn't go back. But the fact of the matter is, as they looked over their shoulders, they saw the Indians killing Vincent Charlie as they came over the top of that hill. And they will find him after the battle with a stick rammed down his throat.
Okay. Now here they retreated back into the siege. So explain what happens with the siege the next day. And of course, the Indians are reinforced with all the weapons they've seized from all those people that they've killed uh, on the ridge of Custer and everything. But just explain what happens here.
Yeah, here you have this really. It's a good little map. Shows all the different companies and how they lined up. It's interesting because the men were ordered to dig trenches. And now they had cups. They didn't have many shovels at all, but they used their tin cups and their cooking utensils, whatever they had, to dig little trenches to get down as low as they could. And the wars begin to surround them. They take that high position, Sharpshooter's Ridge over there to the left, upper left. There's also a ridge outside the map to the north where they line up in huge numbers, and they find large numbers of captured soldier casings fired from that ridge, which have a range of six. By the way, the ridge was 600 yards away, which is about the range of the Springfield. And they're just pouring gunfire for the rest of the afternoon. They're pouring gunfire into these areas. They begin to take more casualties. The soldiers do, of course. Very few Indian casualties. There's one warrior who's killed after named Long Road that you can see at the end of the Company H position. By the way, Benteen has the most exposed position. It's a little ridge. If you kind of look at this, it's kind of like a skillet, and the middle of the skillet's a hollow spot, and you got the high ridges on the outside, and then you got the handle, which is where Benteen's located. And for whatever reason, he doesn't order his men to dig in. They don't dig trenches, and they're catching gunfire from both sides. They're catching gunfire from down here on the riverside and from the north side, and they're also getting pressed from where Long Road is over there. Wars are beginning to come up those areas, and Benteen begins to realize if his position falls. By the way, Benteen's company will take some of the highest casualties because of their exposure and probably because they didn't have trenches up there. They will eventually order some of French's M Company to come up there and help reinforce him. But Benteen, by the way, Reno's pretty much in a ditch over there. And in essence, and a lot of people call Benteen the savior of the seventh, and I wouldn't disagree with that. He walks around very bravely, won't lay down in the trenches. He draws gunfire. He has his fingertip and his boot heel shot off. He encourages the men to stand up and shoot, and and they look at him and say, "Do we have to?" And he's trying to show bravery. He's trying to show his he was a brave guy. In some ways, a lot like Custer. But Reno will lead a charge off his side over there near Weir's company, Company D. As the Indians begin to press, they will lead a couple of charges. And we know Benteen will actually lead a really good, strong charge off the end of his position out towards that little hill and ravine off to the right of the map there and drive all the warriors back from that area. And they talk about how that the Indians look like acrobats in a circus doing flips trying to get out of there. And so he drives them back. And of course, there's wounded men who need water. And they're going to ask they're going to ask for volunteers to go down to the river. You see Water Carriers Ravine there. And they probably went down more than one ravine, by the way. And but there'll be at least, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember the exact numbers. I think there's 19 men that get Congressional Medals of Honor for bravery and most of them will get that Medal of Honor for getting water for the wounded. Only one surviving doctor is up there, Dr. Porter. He creates a hospital among the mules and the horses. There's tremendous gunfire killing the mules and the horses up there. And anyway, uh, there's a lot of spunk shown by Dr. Porter. He said if we don't get water for these wounded, a lot of them are going to die. And so men volunteer to go down and get water for the wounded. The next morning, of course, on the 26th, the day two of the battle, the warriors, as soon as the sun comes up at 4:30 in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning, the gunfire begins again. And there's lots more shooting going on. There's another Indian warrior who's riding out there who's killed kind of in an open area. There's not many Indian casualties down there, evidently only maybe two known for sure. Um, but it's by the middle of the day, the warriors begin to pull back. Sitting Bull says to the warriors, "Just go ahead and leave them alone." They begin to see General Terry and his people and Gibbon coming down the valley, and so they decide to pack up and leave. And there's like one final volley by the warriors before lunchtime, and then pretty much they go down and pack up their families and their teepees. And the soldiers begin to cheer as they see the warriors going across the valley. They try to set the valley on fire to burn up all the grass and to kind of shield their escape. I don't know if you can call it escape. It was just an exodus. Matter of fact, some people talked about it being like Moses leaving Egypt, and it was the warriors and their families and all their horses. They said it took hours for them to go out of sight because it was a massive village, and they watched it from the hills. And then, of course, we know the next morning is when General Terry will find those guys on top of the hill and give them the message that they found the Custer dead about 4 miles away.
Right. They, of course, do not know that or expect that to happen. And one controversy that occurs later is years later, Godfrey, who's one of I guess you could say he's in the Custer camp, Lieutenant Godfrey, he confronts Benteen, and Benteen says, "You don't know the half of it. Um, we were gonna, Reno wanted to abandon all the wounded and have a night breakout." Now, do you find what's your assessment of that?
It's possible. He's the only source for that. Benteen is. And, he didn't like Reno anyway. We talked about that last week. There was some animosity between them, but I wouldn't put it beyond. I mean, Reno had left a lot of men down in the valley in the timber, some of them wounded. So he wasn't beyond doing that. In the middle of the battle, he did that. One of the things that I think it's important to remember that it's very possible that night, that first night, that Reno might have been he could have been very intoxicated. As a matter of fact, two of the civilian packers bump into Reno and they slosh alcohol on him, and they said he was very intoxicated. And they hear Reno laughing in his tent. I wonder where the Marat of the army is. And of course, Marat was a famous French flashy general. And so Reno's kind of chiding, wonder where Custer is, and talking to some officers in one of the tents up there. But evidently he was pretty intoxicating according to these civilian contractors, these packers didn't care about the regiment's honor or anything else. And they went after Reno. And so, if you're drinking that much, that might have been a proposition that Reno may have made. But again, the only person who talks about that is Benteen.
Interesting. All right, so let's open it up to everybody. Questions and
We,
comments
we
to,
should finish one more thing
yeah,
real quickly.
please.
How does Custer die?
Oh yeah, how does he die? Yeah.
Left that part out. Well, we know that E&F companies in the Custer headquarters, they went down below where the National Cemetery is, down to that other fording area. And according to Two Moon, those men all came up to the top of that hill, the Custer headquarters, along with E&F companies. They said the men with the gray horses, Company E, put their horses down in that ravine right below the hill there. And they began to fight from the top of the hill. Two Moon said all of a sudden there was a bugle call, and 40 men came off the top of the hill, and they went down below where that hill was and fought down in that area. And that evidently was Company E. And it evidently was a planned movement, much like Company C at the other end. A lot of pressure from warriors. Company C sent down to drive him back. Doesn't work for Company C. Company E's driven down to what's called Cemetery Ridge. It's a ridge in the National Cemetery now. And by the way, Gall actually had them reenact. He saw on the 10th anniversary, he had some soldiers out there, and they reenacted the skirmish line where Company E was fighting there.
Hmm.
So we have some photographic evidence from D.F. Berry 10 years later where Custer's fighting in the cemetery. Anyway, the warriors will surround Custer Hill. They will stampede the gray horses. Those are the last horses on the battlefield, evidently. At the very end of the battle, Custer will take sorrel horses from the other end that men had escaped on them. They will shoot them in a circle on top of the hill. Custer knows about the Beecher Island fight, where they're able to haul off huge numbers of warriors by finding a stationary position behind animals.
Hmm.
He will try that ineffectively, obviously. And the Indians said that, and this is where all the artwork gets kind of crazy because you have all these hand to hand combat taking place with soldiers and Indians on top of Custer's Last Stand Hill there. And according to the Indians, that didn't happen. They said most of us were lying down, shooting at the hill. We couldn't even see the soldiers. We knew where they were, hiding behind their dead horses up there. We just kept shooting. By this time, they had most of the soldier weaponry they captured from Calhoun Hill. They're using those soldiers' weapons against them, long range. And they said finally the gunfire ceased. And we all ran to the top of the hill. Again, this is kind of what Weir sees from Weir Point, or Edgerly at least. And they said that we killed the wounded soldiers that were on top of the hill. One of those young men up there, his name was Big Beaver. He was a Cheyenne, a young guy. He said, as I was on top of the hill, shooting and killing the men on top of the hill, I looked down where the cemetery is today, and there were still 15 or 20 men fighting, the men who rode white horses, gray horses, Company E. They're still fighting after Custer Hill falls. This is a real intriguing thing. Again, talk about timing.
Hmm.
And Big Beaver said they began to run out of ammunition and threw away their big guns and you fought with their little guns. And they began to run into a deep ravine, which was nearby. And of course, we talked about this, I think, a little bit maybe last week, or maybe we didn't. They're going to find 28 men from Company E in the bottom of Deep Ravine. And according to almost every Indian account, the last men who died on the field at that end were killed in the Deep Ravine.
Interesting. Interesting.
So it destroys the idea of Custer being the last to die on the hill because we know there was another company, an entire company, or what was left of an entire company, who tries to flee almost out of ammunition, trying to get to the river, try to hide in the timber, human human activity, trying to survive.
Interesting.
And of course, none of them will. So that's how the battle ends.
Interesting. And I must admit, we're moving to Q&A right now because we've been almost here for 3 hours. But I could usually see, hey, we could have Michael here talk about a whole bunch of other things. Okay, anyway, go on. People who have questions and comments. Go on, Joe.
Yes, two quick ones. Well, one's quick. On day two, the siege, is Crazy Horse there, or is he just physically wiped out from day one? And the more conjectural question, if for any reason Crazy Horse doesn't make the fight at all, including day one, what Indian would we be talking about, or would they not have fought as well as they did?
Yeah. Crazy Horse was important for inspiration. A lot of the warriors talk about when he made that charge. And by the way, we kind of know where Crazy Horse fights in the battle. We know that during the battle, he said, I came up a ravine on the other end of the village. We know that the village stopped where the Cheyenne camp was, and the ford that's near there is Deep Ravine Ford. And Camp interviewed several Indians and said Crazy Horse came up Deep Ravine and came up behind the soldiers where Calhoun Hill was. When Company C rides down and dismounts and begins to try to drive the warriors back, they have horse holders behind them. And we don't know, Crazy Horse doesn't describe, or the warriors around Crazy Horse, including Flying Hawk, they don't say who they're shooting at, but they say that Crazy Horse has a repeating weapon and he's just picking off those horse holders left and right. He was killing them as fast as he could. And that helps Company C to probably panic down there. I found kind of an unpublished account by Flying Hawk that said that Crazy Horse went up to a soldier and killed him, a man who rode a sorrel horse. So we have a pretty good idea from the evidence and the accounts that Crazy Horse was fighting among those Company C guys down in that area. He will eventually, from there, evidently ride over the top of the ridge to the Keogh sector, is what we call it today. And that's where the Indians talked about how brave he fought. What's fascinating is there's no indication of Crazy Horse fighting near Custer Hill. He's not talked about fighting down there at all. As a matter of fact, I have found an account where he was chasing Corporal Foley. If you begin to read one of the accounts, he's actually chasing that guy on the sorrel horse. So he's away from Custer Hill probably when it falls, timing wise. Uh, you got to remember, too, these warriors are competing against one another for war honors. White Bull, who's Sitting Bull's uh, nephew, who's a mini Conju, he's up there with Crazy Horse on that ridge top. And he says, there's a soldier down there. He's wounded or he's dead. Why don't you go down there, Crazy Horse, and count coup on him? You count 4 coup or 5 coup on the soldier's body. The first one's the most important one. That's the one that gets you an eagle feather, pretty much. So White Bull's challenging Crazy Horse to go down and count coup on that soldier. And Crazy Horse shakes his head and says, no way. And White Bull goes down there and does it instead. And after the battle, White Bull's saying, I counted the first coup. Crazy Horse counted number 2. And so these guys are going kind of back and forth after the battle, talking about how brave each and every one of them was. Now, to answer your question on the Reno Hill down there, there's no discussion, as far as I know, of Crazy Horse being down at that siege. It's basically a siege. There's even one account that I have read that Crazy Horse actually went down Reno Creek and was waiting around those rocks, hoping the soldiers would try to escape and to try to pick them off if they tried to escape. And the reason we know that supposedly is there was a pictograph drawn by Crazy Horse called the Crazy Horse pictograph, drawn down there not too far from the Lone Teepee site and those big bluffs. So that's a story of Crazy Horse. And we don't know. There's that. Unfortunately, the petroglyph is not there anymore. Hank Warbert went out there to look for it, and when he found parts of it, it was gone. It had collapsed. But that's an interesting story, and that may give you an insight on where Crazy Horse might have been on the second day of the fight, or even the first day of the fight, because he's not talked about being down there at the Reno fight for the most part from any literature that I've read.
Thank
And I
you.
haven't heard anything from the Clown family or his relatives, and I've heard them, they've never talked about that either.
Michael,
Yes.
No, the other Michael,
Oh,
me. Um, yeah, thank you for, I mean, again, massive amounts of detailed information. And
probably more than you wanted.
no, it's great. No, you got the right
no.
crowd for this, Michael.
Yeah,
Believe me.
yeah. You got to know who you're dealing with, right? But you really, and a lot of myth busting, which is important also, or truth telling, I should say. Um, I have 2 questions, but there's one, the smaller one, the more specific one, is because you talked about how Custer was killed. Does anybody know how exactly Custer died? Custer in particular. I mean, we know the myths and we know the competing stories, but do we know that for in other words, do we have a pretty good idea on how he died? Because there's a lot of myths about that. competing myths sometimes.
It's a great
Um,
question. Yeah, let me
and
answer that first before I answer your
okay,
second. One of the things we know about Custer's body, he was found not on the very peak, but he was found close to the peak, about 6 feet from where the big monument is today. He was found nude. He had his socks on. He was stripped of all of his clothing. He was not scalped because he had his hair cut short. His wife Libby had a nightmare about him being scalped, and it's a summer campaign, so he keeps his hair short, not like it was in the Civil War and so forth. He's found stripped. He's found with a bloody bullet wound. He's found laying on his back on top of some troopers. He's found with a bloody bullet wound in the left temple. According to one soldier, it came out the right side. The blood had run down his face into his mustache and mouth onto the top of his forearm, leading some to believe he was shot in the arm, but that's not the case. And then they also found a bullet wound near his heart, almost right over his heart, and there was no blood coming from that wound, which leads most of the soldiers who saw the body to believe that the head wound was the one that killed him. And they don't believe it was a suicide. Matter of fact, Weir and Bendine looked for signs of a suicide. Looked for powder burns near that left temple. Of course, Custer was right-handed, but looked for powder burns on the left temple and found none. So they began to realize quickly it wasn't a suicide. Matter of fact, some of the soldiers who saw the bullet wound in the head said it looked like a small caliber, maybe Henry, a small sized bullet that may have hit Custer in the head. Probably the chest wound was post-mortem. So again, this whole idea, like you see in the movie Crazy Horse, Custer shot in the chest, shot in the heart, and then he rides for another 2 miles and keeps on fighting is a great myth. They did find two other body parts that were messed up a little bit. His left thigh had a slash all the way to the femur bone, about 6 to 10 inches long, evidently. The warriors would do that, of course, sometimes to keep a soldier from mounting a horse in the next life. And you see that in a lot of photographs of some of the mutilated. And then, of course, according to Godfrey, and they kept a lot of this from Mrs. Custer, he had an arrow shoved up his penis. And Godfrey's the one that talks about that. There's a Cheyenne oral story about his fingertip being cut off, but nobody talks about that. So I think that is probably a myth. There's all kinds of credit on who did this, and nobody, for the most part, almost all the warriors said we didn't know who Custer was. We didn't know he was fighting there. Some will argue against that, and there's even the, and I guess I can say this on to this group, and I've heard this pouted by some of the tribes. There's the Arapaho suffocation theory. And if you haven't heard that, after the battle, Custer was wounded, laying up there, and a big Arapaho woman went up there, pulled up her skirt, sat on his face, and suffocated him. And that's one of the myths that you hear, and I've even heard Cheyennes talk about that as well. But again, the bullet wound in the head is probably what killed Custer.
well, I can only say that I hope that shoving the arrow up his penis, I hope that happened after he was dead. But anyway, no, the other questions I had were, well, first of all, again, to what degree did the cavalry leaders, the Custer, Benteen, Reno, underestimate the fighting capacity of First Nations at the beginning? Obviously, as the battle went on, they didn't underestimate it, but did that play into it? And also, because I haven't been able to get a clear answer to this. I know what the stated reasons were and everything, but as far as grand strategy goes, what did each side hope to achieve with this campaign?
Well,
I know. Oh, go on. Sorry.
wait, go ahead. Your first question was about the officers. I think they totally underestimated the fighting capabilities of the Lakota and the Cheyenne. I especially believe they didn't realize how ferociously they would fight with their families nearby. I think that was a major matter of fact. Everybody, including Crook, including Gibbon, including Terry, they all believed that if you got close to the village, they were going to run and they were going to scatter. As a matter of fact, it was in Custer's mind, it was in everybody's mind, especially when they're going down Reno Creek, that this village is going to take off. We're going to be chasing them for the rest of the summer. They'd been looking for him for 5 weeks. They weren't about to let him get away. And I think in the back of all these officers' minds, they were talking about, don't let him escape, don't let him escape. And so that was in the mind of especially Custer as they're coming down here because they're all afraid they're going to flee. Now, the thing that Custer didn't know is he's going to surprise the village. Even as he's coming down Reno Creek, I think he believes that they're already scattering. He's shocked when he sees that the village is still standing. Um, so I think again he doesn't realize how ferociously they're going to fight to protect their women and children down there. And the warriors talk about that over and over and again in their testimony and so forth. As far as what each side was going to gain, the village had no choice for the most part.
Right.
Their choice was to defend their families. In the long run, of course, they were trying to defend that way of life. But in essence, when they whipped the 7th Cav there and that news got back, that was, it was all everybody on board at this point as far as the U.S. government and the Army. They're going to chase them down, and they'll never win a victory like that again as they roam the plains out there. So, again, theirs was a defensive fight. And if you read Sitting Bull's biographies and you read about them, he just wanted to be left alone for the most part. He wanted to stay away from the whites as much as possible. Now, he wanted to war with the other tribes.
Yeah.
He began to read about that. He didn't like these other tribes, and these other tribes didn't like Sitting Bull's people. One of the things I didn't mention in the village, some of the people in the village are going out raiding, and they talk about that coming back right before the battle after they've been raiding against some of the other tribes. So they weren't all Boy Scouts enjoying a nice environmental reunion down there. And as part of the culture, as I talked about last time, this is a warrior culture. And so that's part of it. Now, the U.S. government, of course, what they're hoping to do is to force them to the reservation, to make them more dependent, where they can open up those lands, of course, which they will eventually do. We know they will take the Black Hills away from the Lakota right after that. They'll get some forced signatures from some of the tribesmen and so forth, an opportunity to open up the Black Hills. And there's still debate about this. The tribes are still fighting the U.S. government to this day about the ownership of the Black Hills. But
Yeah.
that
Quick
was
question about
you know.
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
question about the monument to Custer at West Point. It was a rather large monument. There must be some type of a story about that.
Well, we talked about that last week. The fact that it's a beautiful obelisk. They did a
You're
funeral.
talking about the one at West Point.
Yeah.
At West Point. They did a nice funeral in October for Custer. He sat there. I think he was at Fort Riley for a long time in a box, and then Libby made provisions to have him buried at West Point. She's the one responsible for that. And by the way, if you go in that, its chapel's still there. It's really kind of cool. You can almost feel the ghost of Custer when you're in that room. Think about that funeral for him and that thing. And then they walked him out, and there's this beautiful, basically an obelisk on the cemetery grounds there. Kind of overlooks the Hudson. It's actually a beautiful sight. And on one side of the monument is a picture of Custer, kind of a Civil War relief bronze on horseback, kind of your cavalier kind of looking bronze. And I don't know who the artist was that did that. Ironically, this is what I find really strange when I go there and look at that, is on the other end is a buffalo. you know, and I just find that kind of ironic. That the buffalo, is used by the warriors, and they depend on it. It's their kin, so to speak, is what they refer to the buffalo as, and they use it for 50 items each and every day. And here is Custer, who, by the way, goes out and does a lot of buffalo hunting with dignitaries. And there's a large, expansive time, about 6 or 7 months, where he's doing a lot of diplomatic work for the government, taking people on rides, buffalo hunts, things like that. But and of course, the extermination of the buffalo would help to end that nomadic way of life. One of the things that I think is really important to talk about is that there's a lot of reasons And I've watched so many shows, even Ken Burns' show on TV about the demise of the buffalo. And I find that it's really intriguing that there was a lot of reasons why the buffalo declined so quickly from the millions and millions. Some people say 40 million. One reason was, of course, the hide hunters. Uh, People in New York wanted buffalo tongue and they wanted hides, and they were killed off by the millions by hide hunters. Another reason was climate change. There was climate change back then, what they call the Little Ice Age, and that was taking a toll on the buffalo herds, along with the feral horse herds competing with the grazing areas. Another thing that's not talked about hardly at all is the huge numbers of buffalo that were killed for trade goods.
Hmm.
There were places on the Missouri River that were getting 50, 60,000 hides from the Indians for trade purposes. Like I was talking about that crazy horse. I mean, Sitting Bull didn't want people relying on the trading post so much. And then this is something that no one, I've only read one person, and he's really good at talking about this. People don't realize that an Indian teepee had to be changed out about once every year, year and a half. And that the buffaloes used for the buffalo hide teepees in that camp at Little Bighorn were all female hides. You didn't use buffalo bull hides. The female hides were lighter. So what happens when you wipe out the female part of a buffalo population? So you see, you have all these different reasons why the buffalo are demising, and basically Teddy Roosevelt helps to save them. But that has nothing to do with the memorial, except that it's on the memorial. But like I said last time, we don't know if Custer's there or not for sure. By the way, there's been attempts to get the Custer family to dig up the grave and check for DNA. They won't do that.
Right. It's probably not there.
It could be Private Smith buried to Libby Custer.
Absolutely.
Don't they have a record of his burial there at West Point? They should have a record of it. So,
do you remember what I talked to you about last week? When they went up to the top of the hill and they thought they found Custer's bones?
Okay.
And they only found about 2 bones. They found part of his spine, which was the third attempt to find Custer's body.
That's all was really found of Custer, right?
Small possible segment of Custer. He wasn't identifiable. The wolves had scattered everything. And by the way, the Indians kept digging up those graves, looking for scalps and looking for other things buried there. When they put those big stones on top of that grave, it was like a neon sign to the warriors that said, "Dig here." After the Battle of Rosebud, the warriors went back over and dug up all those soldiers that were killed with Crook, scalped them, and took all their blankets from the graves.
Mm-hmm. I find it kind of interesting that that's a pyramid at the West Point Cemetery. You know, and it doesn't really go with a lot of the other things there. I wonder why they settled on a pyramid on top of his grave.
Obelisks like that were popular during that time period. Those kind of almost Egyptian, that was very, very popular during that time for monuments. Matter of fact, if you think about it, there's a big fat one on top of the mass grave of the soldiers. It's a big fat obelisk back there. So, but you got to remember that there's a good chance that Custer's not at West Point. But that's going to be a myth that's going to be it's going to be continued. Again, if there was no doubt that it was Custer, probably the Custer family would allow them to be dig up. And what happens if they dig it up and it's not Custer's body? Then you've really destroyed a myth.
Well, does anybody else have any comments or questions? Because we certainly have kept Michael here for quite a while. Go on, well, Michael. Yeah, go on, Michael.
Yeah, well, just to finish up, because, and again, a more overview, the building up of the myth about Custer and the Last Stand, etc., at the expense of a myth built up about the from the Native American First Nations point of view. Is that part of? I mean, in other words, is there a racial component to any of this? I could say racist component. How did this myth, why in this particular battle and this particular person, Custer, was this myth built so out of proportion, do you think?
All right, Michael, before we answer that, I actually have, I was tempted to do that with Michael today, but perhaps we can have Michael talk about that in great length because I will send him the PowerPoint I created for that particular question. Uh, but perhaps another time, Michael, we could hear you talk about that because I think that's extraordinarily important. But go on, please.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people don't realize, there was a tremendous racial prejudice against the natives of this period. We know that for a fact.
Yeah.
Even Custer uses the word savages, and most of these people looked at them as uncivilized savages, and looked at them as a lower class of human beings. And not everybody. I'm not saying everybody did that, but a lot of the people back in the East did believe that, and especially people out West believed it. But there's also a component on the other side of this thing, is that the Lakota and even the Cheyenne, there's a racial component to the way that they looked at the whites, and that rarely gets brought up by anybody. And I would sometimes bring that up at the battlefield during my talks. That the word that they would use to describe whites was the washishu. You may have heard that in movies like Dances with Wolves and things like that. The word washishu means stealer of the fat, or it means basically thief. And so anybody basically that was white was a thief. And that's kind of the way they looked at the entire Euro American population. Um, I think that's something that sometimes gets kind of forgotten or left out. As a matter of fact, I have Lakota friends, and they believe that the entire American continent was given by the everywhere spirit to just the Lakota, not the other tribes. They were meant to dominate those other tribes. So there was a feeling of superiority among many of these tribes, especially the Lakota. And by the way, the word Lakota evidently means the people. The word Cheyenne also, some people talked about being dog soldiers and kin to the dogs, and not kin to the dogs, but having dogs in their camp and so forth. Their name also translates as the people. In other words, kind of like the chosen. We could use that word sometimes. And I always like to bring up this story and to make people think about racial stereotypes and to think about people of different races and colors and backgrounds. There was a young boy there at the battle. His name was Black Elk. He was an Oglala Lakota. He was a relative of Crazy Horse. And one of the things that his mama taught him as he grew up is whatever you do, stay away from the white man, stay away from the Washishu, whatever you do, because they are the boogeyman. And he was trained to think that his entire life growing up as a young boy, that the white man was the actual monster or the boogeyman. And so that kind of gives you kind of some insights into the way that some of these warriors thought. And it was interesting to hear Black Elk's response the first time he saw Washishu. He's chasing the men across the river down at the crossing, Reno's men that is, and he sees a soldier who's wounded and lying down there on the grass, couldn't get across the river, who's wounded and shot. And a warrior rises up to this 13-year-old boy and says, "Get off your horse and scalp that soldier." And he said they looked strange to me. They were pink and they were hairy. They kind of looked like animals to him because they didn't look like the Lakota that he grew up with. He says, "I took my knife and I began to scalp the soldier, and he began to grit his teeth. And then I took out my revolver that I had gotten from my grandmother and I shot the soldier in the head, and I took my first scalp. Now, taking the first scalp was a great honor, and also you had the man's spirit and soul, which belonged in his hair. You'd never have to fight him again." And he takes that scalp, rides across the valley up to the hills where he finds his mother and shows her that scalp from that Washishu. And she sings an honor song to him because on that day he had become a warrior. So I hope that might give you a few little insights into the fact that both sides look down on one another. And by the way, that still happens today, doesn't it? I think one of the things we have to contemplate, whether the color of a person's skin makes them less of a human being. And
Mm.
we see that in the news. We see it debated every day, even today, 150 years later.
All right, Alex, you'll have the last question here. Go on, Alex.
Well, kind of to relate. First, again, I kind of want you to talk a little bit more like what's happening during the night of the first day. Um, is there, especially again what the Indians said, do they hear a lot of, wounded crying out, or is is anybody still shooting into the hill? And
Well,
yeah,
they have a small party. When it gets dark, they do not. They can't see one another. Matter of fact, it was fearful for the Indians and it was fearful for the soldiers because they didn't know how close these warriors were. They had them entrenched, so they didn't have to have a huge numbers of warriors. I think they realized that they had whooped them and so forth, and so they had them surrounded. What was interesting is you do hear some of the accounts by the warriors that they were blowing bugles through the night. Now, that should have said something to the men on Reno Benteen Hill. They're seeing warriors riding around with guidons, company guidons, which are pretty important to each company. And then you're hearing people riding around trying to play a bugle out there. So that should have been somewhat of a giveaway to the soldiers what had happened to some of those guys downstream. The rest of the stories that you hear mainly about are from the people that were down in the village that night. And of course, there are a lot of people. They think at least maybe 60 warriors, maybe more, were killed outright. And they're preparing those bodies for burial. If you're a Lakota, what you would do is you'd build a scaffold or you'd find a tree. Or in this case, at Little Bighorn, they found two teepees full of dead warriors on scaffolds inside the teepees across some deep ravine with their horses. By the way, you had to have your horse in the next life, so they shot your horse, and your horse was going to be laying outside that teepee of the dead warriors. That was if you're a Lakota. And so there's a lot of people crying and mourning and sad and preparing those burials probably almost all night. Then you have the Cheyennes, which had a different burial ceremony. They didn't bury people in scaffolds for the most part. They took their dead, buried them in rim rocks and ledges and things like that near the battlefield, including some up on top of the where the horses were held, all the way down Reno Creek. Their ranchers talked about finding bodies of warriors among those ledges and cliffs. Even lame white man was taken all the way over to close to Busby and buried over there later on. But there's a lot of that going on. According to the warriors, there was no celebration going on that night. The soldiers said we heard lots of singing and dancing and drumming down in the village. And I'm sure there was probably a lot of that was the mourning ceremonies and stuff, people that died. But at the same time, knowing the warrior culture, you cannot help but know that some of those warriors around the campfires are telling stories of their bravery and what happened during the battle. You know that was being shared that night as well.
right. And of course, kind of like this, of course, is kind of the romantic 19th century view. I guess it's painting
Well,
of
again,
battle by Paxson, and of
Yeah.
course, with both sides kind of cramped together and like obviously some kind of hand-to-hand combat and and I kind of with that I just wonder if there's any evidence at all of any hand-to-hand combat or if that's just
There's
a complete myth.
probably a little at the very end. There was a group of what we call suicide warriors, some young men who had vowed the night before. They did a dance. This was a Cheyenne custom, a young boy who thought he might go into battle and not come out. In other words, he was willing to sacrifice his life. We would call him a kamikaze warrior today. And most of those guys died in the battle, and they came up towards the end of the fight, rode up to where the cemetery was, and rode down and stampeded the gray horses. And then some of them rode up towards Last Stand Hill where they were killed. So if anybody was killed in hand-to-hand combat, it might have been some of those suicide warriors. We know that one of them was closed hand, and I can't remember the other one. He's got a marker up on top of the hill there, but there was probably a little of that going on, but not for the most part, not in that like the Paxton painting,
Yeah,
which has quite a few errors in it besides the hand to hand.
right,
Some of the flags are off in that one, by the way, and
right.
they have guys with World War I canteens rather than that. And there's some other things. One of the I know this because I've looked at all these and talked about them. One of the farriers' emblems on his shoulder is upside down, things like that. But I think Paxton did a good job. Godfrey provided all that information, by the way. There's some great information at the Cody Museum where Godfrey describes the uniforms and what they look like. And of course, we know Custer had his buckskin suit off and he had his hair cut short. But yeah, there's a lot of things. I think Gaul is depicted in that. A lot of what Paxton tried to do is to squeeze in all those famous warriors into that one painting.
Yeah.
And all the famous characters. It's a dynamic painting, by the way. It's really
Is Reno in it too then?
Reno's not in that one. No, this is a Custer's Last Stand Hill painting.
Okay.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Michael, so much because
You bet.
it's really great to hear you because you certainly did completely puncture a whole bunch of stories that we have about the battle.
Love of timelines more than anything else. Timelines are a real problem for a lot of folks. I've never quite understood why people want to have a minute by minute thing, and a lot of people do, but it's impossible to prove. It's easy to disprove, but impossible to prove. And I think what you got to do when you talk about the battles, talk about general times rather than really specific times.
Well, what it shows me how accurate. I'll never forget the first time I ever interviewed Forrest Pogue, who was a sergeant in the historical section of the U.S. First Army in World War II. And his great comment to me was when he interviewed guys coming out of the Battle of St. Lo, he had to separate them to have them come up with any common. In other words, it was just a couple of days after they'd been fighting a certain action, but everybody remembered something completely different from the other guy.
Yeah.
And the longer you kept them away from the time of the battle, the more confusing it got. And so this particular battle is an example of that par excellence.
Exactly.
But anyway, I want to thank you so much, Michael. It's just a great pleasure to work with you. And
Absolutely.
thank you
for the opportunity. Okay.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you.